The blood had seeped between the floorboards. It was the landlady who noticed it first, Mrs. Adelaide Hartley, climbing the narrow stairs of number 47 Baker Street on a grey March morning in 1873, carrying fresh linens for her lodger's room. She had paused on the third-floor landing, her arms full of folded sheets, and looked down at the dark stains spreading across the ceiling plaster below. At first she thought it was water. A leak, perhaps. The building was old, prone to such afflictions. But water did not smell like iron. Water did not carry that thick, sweet odour that caught in the throat and made the stomach turn. She set down the linens carefully, as if sudden movement might disturb something that should not be disturbed. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle of room 7. The lodger, a gentleman she had thought, always quiet, always paid his rent on time, had not been seen for 2 days. She had assumed he was away on business. He travelled often, or so he said. The door was locked from the inside. Mrs. Hartley descended the stairs and fetched the master key from her quarters. She returned with her husband George, a former dock worker with hands that had seen hard labour and eyes that had seen worse. Together they stood before the door, and George fitted the key into the lock. The mechanism turned with a small, definite click. George pushed the door open, and the smell rushed out like something that had been waiting, something that had gathered strength in the darkness behind that locked door. Mrs. Hartley gasped and covered her mouth with her apron. George stepped forward into the room, and then stopped, his body going rigid. What he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The room had been transformed into something that belonged not in London, not in any civilized place, but in the deepest nightmare of human imagination. The furniture had been pushed against the walls, the carpet had been rolled back, and on the bare wooden floor, arranged with terrible precision, were the remains of what had once been human beings. 3 bodies, or rather, 3 collections of carefully separated parts, laid out like specimens in an anatomy theatre. The Metropolitan Police would later count the pieces, the newspapers would publish the numbers, though many readers would faint upon reading them, and London would learn that it had been harbouring something monstrous in the respectable heart of Marylebone. The lodger was gone, the window stood open. And carved into the wooden mantelpiece above the cold fireplace was a message in neat, deliberate letters. The work continues. Chapter 1. The City of Smoke and Progress. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night around you is quiet now, settled into that deep stillness that comes when the world has turned away from daylight. Wherever you are listening from, beneath warm blankets in a distant city, or alone in the small hours of your own night, know that you are safe here. The past cannot reach forward. It can only whisper its truths across the years. Tell me, if you would, where are you listening from tonight? What hour marks your clock as you listen to these words? And if this voice brings you some measure of comfort in the darkness, if these old stories help ease you toward rest, consider subscribing. There are many more nights ahead, many more shadows to explore together. Now, let us drift backward through time, backward through the fog and gaslight, through the great machinery of empire to a city that believed itself the pinnacle of human achievement, the very centre of civilization. Let us return to London in the year 1873, when progress seemed inevitable and the future seemed bright, and when something moved through the crowded streets that belonged not to the future but to humanity's oldest nightmares. London, in the spring of 1873, was the largest city the world had ever known. 4 million people lived within its bounds, packed into a sprawling metropolis that had long since burst beyond its ancient walls. The city stretched for miles in every direction from the Thames, an endless landscape of brick and stone and smoke, of church spires and factory chimneys, of grand boulevards and fetid alleys existing side by side in uneasy proximity. It was the capital of an empire upon which the sun never set. British ships sailed every ocean. British factories produced half the world's manufactured goods. British banks financed projects on every continent. London was where the wealth of that empire accumulated, where it was displayed, where it was spent and enjoyed by those fortunate enough to possess it. The great achievements of Victorian engineering were visible everywhere. The Thames embankment had recently been completed, taming the river and providing modern sewers that finally freed the city from the cholera epidemics that had ravaged previous generations. The Underground Railway, the world's first, now carried passengers beneath the streets in steam-powered trains. Gaslighting illuminated the major thoroughfares, pushing back the darkness that had once made night travel dangerous. The Crystal Palace stood in Sydenham, a monument to industrial progress and human ingenuity. The West End glittered with wealth. Belgravia and Mayfair housed the aristocracy in their white stucco terraces. The gentlemen's clubs of Pall Mall provided refuge for the powerful. The shops of Regent Street and Bond Street offered luxuries from across the globe. In the theatres and music halls, entertainment ran from Shakespeare to sensation, from opera to music hall comedy. Marylebone, where Baker Street ran northward from the chaos of Oxford Street, was a district of the respectable middle classes. Doctors and solicitors, merchants and civil servants, the professionals who formed the backbone of Britain's administrative and commercial power. The streets were clean, the houses well maintained, the residents secure in their position between the aristocracy above and the working masses below. Yet London was also a city of profound darkness. Beyond the gaslit boulevards lay districts where poverty ground millions into desperate existence. The East End, Whitechapel, Spitalfields, Bethnal Green, housed families in single rooms, 10 or 12 to a space meant for 2. Children grew up stunted from malnutrition. Disease spread through overcrowded tenements. The Thames, for all its new embankments, still received the waste of 4 million people and the effluent of countless factories and tanneries. Crime flourished in the rookeries and courts, those maze-like districts where the police rarely ventured except in large groups. Prostitution was endemic. Estimates suggested 50,000 women sold themselves on London's streets. Opium dens operated openly in Limehouse. The prisons at Newgate and Pentonville were constantly full. The gallows at Newgate saw regular use, with public hangings drawing crowds in the thousands until they had been moved behind prison walls just a decade before. London in 1873 existed in a state of contradiction. It was the most advanced city in human history, and simultaneously one of the most brutal. It was a place where scientific progress and rational thought were celebrated, where Darwin's theories were debated in learned societies, where medicine was becoming a true science rather than an art of guesswork and tradition, and yet it was also a city where Jack the Ripper would walk 15 years later, where the Gothic imagination of the era populated the fog with vampires and monsters, where the division between civilization and savagery felt thin as paper. The Metropolitan Police, established in 1829, had brought some order to the chaos. Their distinctive uniforms, blue coats and top hats, were a familiar sight on every major street. They walked fixed beats, checking doors, confronting drunks, maintaining the public peace. Scotland Yard coordinated investigations from its headquarters on the Thames Embankment. Detective work was becoming more sophisticated, with photography now used to record crime scenes and maintain records of known criminals. But the police were still learning. Forensic science barely existed. There were no fingerprint records, no blood typing, no systematic way to identify suspects beyond eyewitness testimony and circumstantial evidence. A clever criminal could move through London with relative impunity, changing lodgings frequently, using false names, disappearing into the vast sea of humanity that filled the city's streets. The medical profession in 1873 was undergoing transformation. The ancient practice of surgery was becoming respectable, no longer the province of barbers and butchers, but of educated physicians. The great teaching hospitals, Guy's, St. Thomas's, St. Bartholomew's, trained students in anatomy and surgical technique. The discovery of anaesthesia and antiseptic procedures had made surgery safer and more ambitious. Physicians could now open the human body, repair what was broken, remove what was diseased, but this knowledge came with a cost. To learn anatomy, medical students needed bodies. The legal supply from executed criminals was insufficient. Though the Anatomy Act of 1832 had regulated the trade, the demand for cadavers still sometimes exceeded supply, and the knowledge of how to dissect a human body, how to separate muscle from bone, how to remove organs cleanly and efficiently. This knowledge was no longer restricted to a small number of physicians, but was spreading through the medical schools and surgical theatres of London. Anyone with access to medical training would know how to take a body apart. They would know which instruments to use, which techniques were most efficient, how to work quickly and precisely. The line between healing and harm, between surgeon and butcher, was simply a matter of intention. Baker Street itself was a long, straight thoroughfare running north from Portman Square toward Regent's Park. It was named after the builder who had developed the area in the previous century, and it represented solid, respectable London. The buildings were mostly Georgian or early Victorian, brick-faced terraces of 3 or 4 stories, with businesses on the ground floors and lodgings above. Number 47 Baker Street was typical of its kind. A narrow-fronted building, 4 stories tall, with a shop selling stationery and periodicals on the ground floor, and rooms to let on the floors above. The proprietors were George and Adelaide Hartley, a couple in their 50s who had owned the property for 15 years. They were known as good landlords, the rooms were clean, the rent reasonable, the house rules sensible. They attracted clerks and commercial travellers, occasionally a professional man down on his luck, sometimes a widow seeking respectable accommodation. They had learned to be cautious. London was full of people reinventing themselves, escaping debts or scandals or simply seeking a fresh start. A landlord who asked too many questions might lose custom, but one who asked too few might find themselves harbouring criminals or worse. The Hartleys had developed instincts about their tenants, could usually spot trouble before it arrived. But sometimes trouble wore a respectable face. Sometimes it paid its rent on time, spoke courteously, and left no obvious signs of its true nature. The lodger who had taken room 7 in January of 1873 had seemed entirely unremarkable. He had introduced himself as Dr. Thomas Morton, a physician recently returned from several years practising in India. He was in his 40s, tall and lean, with dark hair going grey at the temples and a neat beard. He dressed well, but not ostentatiously, the attire of a professional man of moderate means. He spoke with an educated accent, displayed good manners, and paid 3 months' rent in advance with clean Bank of England notes. He explained that he was in London temporarily while arranging a permanent practice. He would be away frequently, he said, visiting colleagues and investigating various opportunities. He would need the room for storage as much as accommodation. He had medical books and equipment that required secure keeping. The Hartleys had seen no reason to refuse him. Room 7 was on the 3rd floor at the rear of the building, with a window overlooking the small yard behind. It was quieter than the front rooms, which suited a gentleman who needed to study. The rent he offered was fair. His references, a letter from a medical society in Calcutta, seemed legitimate. Dr. Morton had moved in with minimal fuss. He arrived with 2 large trunks and several wooden crates, which he carried up to his room with the help of a porter. He kept irregular hours, sometimes absent for days at a time, other times spending long periods in his room with the door locked. The Hartleys occasionally heard him moving about at odd hours, 3 or 4 in the morning, but he was quiet, caused no disturbance to other tenants, and always greeted them politely when their paths crossed on the stairs. If there were strange smells emanating from room 7, they were attributed to medical preparations. If the lodger sometimes had stains on his clothing, they were assumed to be the result of laboratory work. If he received no visitors and no correspondence, it merely suggested a man who valued his privacy. London was full of such men. The city allowed anonymity, encouraged it even. A person could remake themselves, could live as they wished, accountable to no one as long as the rent was paid and the peace was kept. And so Dr. Thomas Morton had lived undisturbed in room 7 of number 47 Baker Street for 2 months, from January through March, going about whatever business he pursued, while below him the Hartleys managed their property and around him other lodgers lived their ordinary lives. None of them knew what was happening behind that locked door. None of them suspected that they were living in proximity to something that would shock London to its core and would be spoken of in horrified whispers for generations afterward. The city went about its business. The factories produced. The ships sailed. The theatres performed. The poor struggled and the rich prospered. Spring came to London as it always did, bringing slightly longer days and the promise of warmer weather ahead. And in room 7 of number 47 Baker Street, Dr. Thomas Morton continued his work, whatever that work was, patient and methodical, surrounded by the 4 million souls of London who had no idea that a monster lived among them. The Metropolitan Police would later try to determine how many victims there had been. They would search records of missing persons, would interview families who had lost contact with loved ones, would attempt to trace the movements of Dr. Morton, if that was even his real name, backward through the weeks and months he had spent in London. But in a city of 4 million, where people arrived and departed daily, where the poor vanished all the time and no one remarked upon it, where anonymity was a way of life, it was impossible to know with certainty how many had died. What was certain was this. On the morning of March the 14th, 1873, Mrs. Adelaide Hartley climbed the stairs of her lodging-house, carrying fresh linens and noticed blood seeping through the ceiling. And what was discovered in room 7 that morning would reveal that London, for all its progress and civilization, for all its gaslight and order, still harboured darkness that belonged to an older, more savage age. The city that believed itself the peak of human achievement was about to learn that evil wore many faces, that monsters did not always announce themselves, and that sometimes the most terrible things happened in the most ordinary places, behind locked doors, in rented rooms, in the respectable heart of the greatest metropolis the world had ever known. Chapter 2. The Discovery at Baker Street. The 14th of March, 1873, began as an unremarkable Thursday morning in Marylebone. The street vendors were already calling their wares along Baker Street by 7 o'clock. The milkman made his rounds with his cart and cans. The crossing sweepers cleared the horse droppings from the cobblestones, hoping for pennies from pedestrians. The omnibuses rattled past, carrying clerks and shopgirls toward their employment in the city and the West End. Smoke rose from 1,000 chimneys into a sky that promised rain before evening. Mrs. Adelaide Hartley rose at her usual hour of 6:30. She was a woman of 52 years, grey-haired and stout, with the perpetually worried expression of someone who had spent decades managing other people's problems. She had been a landlady for 15 years, ever since her husband George had invested their savings in the Baker Street property. It was respectable work, if demanding. The house contained 12 rooms let to various tenants, and each room required attention, cleaning, maintenance, ensuring the occupants paid their rent and caused no trouble. She performed her morning routine with practised efficiency. She lit the fire in the kitchen range and set water to boil. She prepared breakfast for herself and George, porridge with a little milk, bread with butter, tea strong enough to banish the last traces of sleep. George ate quickly and departed for his work. He had maintained employment at the docks despite owning property, finding that the rental income alone was insufficient for their needs, and that idleness did not suit his temperament. After George left, Mrs. Hartley began her daily rounds. She collected the rubbish from the bins on each floor. She checked that the shared water closets were clean. She noted which rooms needed fresh linens, which required coal for their small fireplaces, which tenants were behind on their rent. It was while collecting the linens from her storage cupboard that she decided to bring fresh sheets to room 7. Dr. Morton had been in residence for 2 months now, and she prided herself on maintaining high standards. Every room received fresh linens weekly, whether the tenant requested them or not. She climbed the narrow stairs to the 3rd floor, her arms full of folded sheets that smelled of the lavender water she used in the wash. The stairwell was dim. The house had gas lighting only on the ground floor, with oil lamps and candles for the upper stories. Grey morning light filtered through the small window at each landing. She reached the 3rd floor landing and paused to catch her breath. She was not as young as she once was, and 3 flights of stairs felt steeper with each passing year. As she stood there, shifting the weight of the linens in her arms, she happened to glance upward at the ceiling. There was a stain spreading across the plaster directly above her head. At first she thought little of it. Old houses developed leaks. The roof needed constant maintenance. Rain found its way through the slates and into the spaces between floors, emerging as damp patches on ceilings and walls. It was an endless battle. But as she looked more closely, she realized this stain was not the pale yellow-brown of water damage. It was darker, reddish-brown, and it was still spreading, a slow seepage that had soaked through the plaster and was now beginning to drip. A single drop fell and landed on the white sheet in her arms, leaving a dark spot that spread slowly through the fabric. Mrs. Hartley set down the linens carefully on the landing floor. She looked up at the ceiling again, her mind working through the geography of the house. The 3rd floor landing was directly below room 7, Dr. Morton's room. The smell reached her then, faint but unmistakable. A thick, sweet odour, like spoiled meat left too long in summer heat. The kind of smell that came from the butcher shops in the market, from the offal discarded in the gutters, from things that had once been alive and were now decaying. Her heart began to beat faster. She walked to the door of room 7 and knocked firmly. "Dr. Morton, are you at home?" No answer came from within. She knocked again, louder this time. "Dr. Morton, I must speak with you, sir." Still nothing. The door remained closed. The room beyond it silent. Mrs. Hartley tried the handle, locked. The door would not budge. She stood there uncertainly for a moment, her hand still on the handle, her mind filling with uncomfortable possibilities. Perhaps Dr. Morton had spilled something. Chemicals, medical preparations. Perhaps he was conducting experiments that had gone awry. Perhaps he was ill, lying unconscious on the other side of the door. Or perhaps something worse had happened. She descended the stairs quickly, her earlier exhaustion forgotten, and hurried to the small office where she kept the accounts and the master keys for all the rooms. Her hands shook slightly as she removed the key for room 7 from its hook on the board. She should fetch George, she decided. Whatever was behind that door, she did not want to face it alone. But George was at the docks, a 40-minute walk away. It would take hours to fetch him and return. And if Dr. Morton was injured, lying in need of help, those hours might matter. Mrs. Hartley stood in her small office, the key in her hand torn between caution and responsibility. Finally she compromised. She would open the door just enough to look inside to determine if there was an emergency that required immediate action. If she saw anything alarming, she would close the door immediately and fetch the police. She climbed back up to the 3rd floor, moving more slowly now, dreading what she might find. The stain on the ceiling had spread further in the few minutes she'd been gone. The dripping had increased to a slow but steady trickle. She stood before the door of room 7 and inserted the key into the lock. The mechanism turned with a small, definite sound. She placed her hand on the door handle, took a breath, and pushed the door open. The smell struck her immediately, so powerful it made her gag. She raised her apron to cover her nose and mouth, her eyes watering. The room beyond the door was dark, the curtains drawn across the single window, only a thin line of grey daylight visible around the edges. "Dr. Morton?" Her voice was barely a whisper. She stepped into the room, leaving the door open behind her for light. As her eyes adjusted to the dimness, she began to make out shapes. The furniture had been moved. The bed pushed against one wall, the small writing desk and chair stacked in a corner. The carpet had been rolled back, exposing the bare wooden floorboards, and on those floorboards she saw them. At first her mind refused to comprehend what she was seeing. The shapes were wrong, arranged in ways that made no sense. But as she stood there, frozen in the doorway, understanding came slowly, horribly, like a nightmare surfacing from sleep into waking consciousness. Bodies, or what had been bodies. They lay in 3 separate arrangements on the floor, each positioned as if for display. But they were not whole. They had been taken apart with surgical precision, each component separated and laid out in anatomical order. Mrs. Hartley's vision began to narrow, darkness creeping in from the edges. She felt the floor tilting beneath her feet. Her hand groped for the doorframe, found it, held on as her knees threatened to buckle. She did not scream. Shock had stolen her voice. She could only stare at the horror before her, her mind trying and failing to process what her eyes were reporting. 3 people. 3 human beings who had been alive and were now reduced to this. To pieces arranged on the floor like specimens in a medical theatre, displayed with a care and precision that made it all the more terrible. How long she stood there she could not later say. Time lost its meaning in that room. It might have been seconds or minutes or longer. But eventually her paralysis broke. She staggered backward out of the room, pulling the door closed behind her, and this time she did scream. The sound echoed through the stairwell, high and sharp, a sound of pure horror that brought the other tenants running from their rooms. They found her on the landing, collapsed against the wall, her face white as chalk, her body shaking uncontrollably. She could not speak coherently, could only point at the door of room 7 while gasping for breath. One of the tenants, a clerk named William Perkins, who lodged on the 2nd floor, took charge. He sent another tenant running for the police. He helped Mrs. Hartley down the stairs to her quarters. He prevented anyone else from entering room 7, though the smell alone would have deterred most from approaching. The Metropolitan Police arrived within 20 minutes. Constable James Blackwood and Constable Henry Fletcher, both young men in their 20s, responded to the call. They arrived expecting a domestic disturbance. perhaps a tenant who had died of natural causes and been discovered in an advanced state of decomposition. What they found in room 7 was beyond anything their training or experience had prepared them for. Constable Blackwood, who entered the room first while Fletcher waited on the landing, emerged less than 30 seconds later, his face greenish pale, and vomited into the chamber pot that stood near the stairs. "Get Inspector Aberline," he gasped to his partner. "Get him now, and tell him—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Tell him we need every detective Scotland Yard can spare." By noon, number 47 Baker Street had been transformed into a hive of police activity. A cordon had been established, keeping curious onlookers at a distance. Detectives from Scotland Yard moved through the building, interviewing tenants, examining room 7, documenting everything with the careful precision that modern police work demanded. The man who directed the investigation was Detective Inspector William Aberline, 40 years old, a veteran of the Metropolitan Police who had risen through the ranks through intelligence and determination rather than connections or wealth. He was a solidly built man of medium height, with dark hair and a full beard, dressed in a dark suit and bowler hat that marked him as a professional man of the middle class. Aberline had investigated murders before. London produced them with depressing regularity: domestic violence, robberies gone wrong, drunken fights that ended fatally. But when he entered room 7 on that March afternoon and saw what had been done there, he understood immediately that this was something different. This was not rage or desperation or the random violence of the criminal classes. This was deliberate. This was planned. This was the work of someone with knowledge and skill. Someone who had transformed a rented room into an abattoir and had done so with the care and precision of an artist or scientist. The room was approximately 12 feet square, with a single window overlooking the backyard, a small fireplace that had not been lit in days, and a door that opened onto the third-floor landing. The furniture had been cleared to the edges of the room, creating an open workspace in the centre. On the bare floorboards lay the remains of 3 individuals, separated into their component parts and arranged with meticulous care. The first body, or collection of body parts, was positioned nearest the window. It had been completely disarticulated, every joint separated, every organ removed. The bones were laid out in anatomical order, as if to demonstrate the structure of the human skeleton. The internal organs had been arranged separately, each one placed in a small glass jar filled with what appeared to be alcohol or formaldehyde as a preservative. The second body occupied the centre of the room. It too had been dissected, though not as completely as the first. The head had been separated from the torso. The limbs had been removed at the major joints. The chest cavity had been opened and the ribs carefully cut away to expose the internal organs, which remained in place but had been shifted to display their relationships to one another. The third body, positioned nearest the door, was the most recently dead. Rigor mortis had not yet fully set in. This victim had been opened from throat to pelvis, the skin and muscle pulled back and pinned to the floor with long needles to expose the anatomy beneath. The face was intact, frozen in an expression that suggested the victim had died quickly, perhaps without knowing what was about to happen. Aberline stood in the doorway and forced himself to study the scene methodically, to look past the horror and see the evidence. He had brought a notebook and pencil, and he began to record observations. All 3 victims appeared to be women, though in the state they were in, certainty was difficult. Ages were impossible to determine with precision, but the bone structure and tissue suggested young adults, perhaps between 20 and 35 years of age. The dissections had been performed with considerable skill. The cuts were clean and precise. The joints had been separated at the natural articulation points, rather than crudely hacked through. The organs had been removed without unnecessary damage. Whoever had done this possessed extensive anatomical knowledge and surgical experience. Various instruments lay on a table near the fireplace. Scalpels of different sizes, bone saws, forceps, clamps, all of them clean and neatly arranged. Medical instruments of high quality, the kind used in hospitals and surgical theatres. On the mantelpiece above the cold fireplace, carved into the wood, with what appeared to be a scalpel, were words in neat, deliberate letters: "The work continues." Aberline called for the police photographer. The new technology of photography was revolutionising criminal investigation, allowing crime scenes to be documented with unprecedented accuracy. The photographer arrived with his large camera and tripod, his flash powder and glass plates, and began the grim work of recording what had been found in room 7. While the photographer worked, Abilene descended to question Mrs. Hartley. He found her in her private quarters, still shaking, a cup of sweet tea untouched on the table before her. She had recovered enough to speak, though her voice trembled. She told him everything she knew about Dr. Thomas Morton, when he had arrived, what he had said about his background, how he had behaved during his 2 months of residence. She showed Abilene the ledger where she recorded rent payments, the letter of reference from Calcutta that Morton had provided, the receipt for his deposit. Abilene examined the letter carefully. It appeared genuine, printed on official letterhead, signed with what looked like an authentic signature, but it would need to be verified. He would send a telegram to Calcutta, though he suspected already that the letter was forged, that Dr. Thomas Morton had never practiced medicine in India, that the name itself was likely false. He asked Mrs. Hartley to describe Morton's appearance. She did so as best she could. Tall, lean, dark hair greying at the temples, neat beard, well-spoken, educated accent. It was a description that could fit 10,000 men in London. Nothing distinctive. Nothing that would make him stand out in a crowd. Had Morton had any visitors? Any correspondence? Any regular patterns to his comings and goings? Mrs. Hartley shook her head. No visitors that she had ever seen. No letters delivered. His schedule had been completely irregular. Sometimes gone for days, sometimes in his room for days at a time. She had assumed he was a busy professional man, meeting with colleagues, conducting business. When had she last seen him? She had to think. 2 days ago? 3? He came and went so quietly that she sometimes didn't notice. The last time she remembered seeing him clearly was Sunday evening, March the 11th. He had been leaving the house around 8 o'clock carrying a leather medical bag. He had nodded to her politely and gone out into the street, and she had not seen him since. Abilene made careful notes. Morton, if that was his name, had at least 3 days' head start. He could be anywhere in London by now, or could have left the city entirely. Finding one man among 4 million would be nearly impossible, unless he made a mistake, or unless someone recognised him and came forward. The detective returned to room 7 for a final examination, before the bodies were removed to the mortuary. He studied the message carved into the mantelpiece. The work continues. What work? What had been the purpose of this butchery? The bodies had not been mutilated in rage or for sexual gratification. They had been dissected methodically, scientifically. The arrangement suggested teaching or demonstration. The preservation of organs in jars suggested study or collection. Was Morton conducting some form of anatomical research? Was he a medical student gone mad? A physician whose mind had become warped? Or was he something else entirely? Someone who killed not from any recognisable human motive, but from some alien logic that normal people could not comprehend? Abilene did not know, but he knew that whatever was happening, it had not ended in room 7. The work continues, suggested more victims, more horror yet to be discovered. As the bodies were carefully loaded into the mortuary wagon for transport to the police surgeon, as the sun began to set and gas lamps were lit along Baker Street, as crowds gathered behind the police cordon to stare and whisper, Abilene stood on the pavement and looked up at the building. Somewhere in London, the man who had done this was walking free. He might be watching even now, standing among the crowd of onlookers, observing the police response, perhaps planning his next move. The detective felt a cold certainty settle over him. This investigation would not be quick or easy. The killer was intelligent, careful, and had demonstrated an ability to move through London undetected. Catching him would require every resource Scotland Yard possessed, and even then, success was far from guaranteed. The darkness was falling over the city. In the East End, the gas lamps flickered to life. In the West End, the theatres were opening for the evening performances, and somewhere in the vast sprawl of London, a monster was preparing to continue his work. Chapter 3. The Lodger Who Vanished. The offices of Scotland Yard occupied a building on the Victoria Embankment, overlooking the Thames. It was a modern structure built only a few years before, with gas lighting throughout and the latest conveniences. The Criminal Investigation Department operated from the upper floors, where detectives maintained files on known criminals, conducted interviews, and coordinated investigations across London's vast sprawl. Detective Inspector William Aberline arrived at Scotland Yard at 7 o'clock on the morning of March 15th, having slept poorly and briefly at his lodgings near Waterloo Station. He had spent much of the night thinking about what he had seen in room 7, about the precision of the dissections, about the message carved into the mantelpiece. The work continues. The words haunted him. They suggested purpose, continuation, a larger plan of which the Baker Street horror was only one part. But what work? What could possibly justify or explain such butchery? He climbed the stairs to the CID offices and found several of his colleagues already present, despite the early hour. Word of the discovery had spread through Scotland Yard, and every detective knew that this case would take priority over all others. The Commissioner himself had sent a memorandum demanding daily updates and the allocation of whatever resources were necessary. Sergeant George Godley, Aberline's longtime partner, was waiting at his desk with a cup of tea and a stack of files. Godley was a decade younger than Aberline, lean and sharp-featured, with the aggressive energy of a man who believed that every criminal could be caught through sufficient effort and determination. "The post-mortem examinations are scheduled for 9 o'clock, Godley said without preamble. Dr. Phillips will conduct them personally. The bodies are in terrible condition, he says, but he should be able to determine causes and times of death." Aberline nodded and accepted the tea gratefully. "What about the letter of reference? The one Morton provided to the landlady? Telegram sent to Calcutta last night. Response will take at least 2 days, probably more, but I did some checking with the medical register. There's no Thomas Morton listed as a licensed physician in England, Scotland or Wales. If he practiced medicine, it was either under a different name or without proper credentials. Or he never practiced at all. The medical knowledge could have come from other sources, anatomy classes, surgical training, books, or he could be using a false name but be a legitimate physician who's gone mad." Godley consulted his notes. "I've been compiling a list of missing persons reports from the past 3 months. Women, ages 20 to 40, disappeared without explanation from various parts of London. There are dozens of them, sir, perhaps more than 100. Aberline felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. London was a vast city where people vanished constantly. Servants who absconded with their wages, prostitutes who moved to different districts, women fleeing bad marriages or worse situations. Most were never reported missing. Many had no one who cared enough to file a report. Focus on cases where the woman disappeared completely. No body found, no trace left behind, vanished as if the earth had swallowed them. And cross-reference with locations. I want to know if any of them disappeared from areas near Baker Street, or from districts where Morton might have been operating. It'll take time, sir. The records are incomplete, and many police divisions don't communicate well with each other. Then we'll make them communicate. This is a murder investigation now, probably multiple murders. Every division in London needs to understand that we're hunting someone extremely dangerous." Another detective entered the office. Inspector Edmund Reed, a heavy-set man with a full beard who specialised in East End crime. He was carrying several newspapers, which he spread on the desk before Aberline. "The morning editions," Reed said grimly. "It's already in all of them." Aberline looked at the headlines with dismay. Horror in Baker Street. 3 bodies discovered in lodging house. Butcher of Marylebone claims victims the anatomy murders. Police baffled. The articles, though short on confirmed facts, were long on speculation and sensational detail. They described the scene in room 7 with a level of graphic detail that suggested someone had leaked information to the press. They quoted unnamed police sources saying the murders were the work of a skilled surgeon or anatomist. They speculated about connections to Jack the Ripper. Though those murders wouldn't occur for another 15 years, the newspapers of 1873 were already primed for stories of surgical murders and mysterious killers. "Damn it," Aberline muttered. "This is going to cause panic." "Already has," Reed replied. "I came through Marylebone on my way here. There's crowds outside number 47, people trying to get a look. The landlady's had to barricade herself inside, and women are already changing their movements. My wife says half the servants in our street are refusing to go out after dark." Aberline understood the problem. The publicity would make the investigation harder in multiple ways. It would alert the killer that police were looking for him, giving him time to flee or destroy evidence. It would generate hundreds of false leads and sightings that would consume investigative resources, and it would create public pressure for quick results, pressure that might lead to mistakes or premature arrests. But there was no helping it now. The story was out, and it would only grow larger with each addition. "We need to work fast," Abilene said, "before the trail goes completely cold. Godley, I want you to start interviewing medical schools and teaching hospitals. Find out if anyone matching Norton's description was ever a student or employee. Check the surgical supply houses. Someone with his equipment would have had to purchase it somewhere. Read, coordinate with the divisions. I want every missing persons case from the past 6 months collected and analysed." The two men nodded and departed to their assignments, leaving Abilene alone with the morning newspapers and his growing sense that this investigation would be unlike any he had handled before. At 9 o'clock, he made his way to the mortuary in St. Pancras, where the bodies from Baker Street had been taken. Dr. George Bagster Phillips, the police surgeon, was a man in his 60s with a wealth of experience examining the victims of London's violence. He had conducted thousands of post-mortem examinations during his career, had testified at countless inquests and trials. But when Abilene entered the examination room, he could see that even Phillips was disturbed by what he had found. The 3 victims lay on separate tables, partially covered with sheets. Phillips had begun the work of examining them, making careful notes, taking measurements, attempting to determine who these women had been and how they had died. "Inspector," Phillips said, looking up from his work, "this is the most methodical killing I've ever encountered. Whoever did this possessed extraordinary skill and knowledge. Can you determine causes of death?" The most recent victim, the 3rd one, died from a severed carotid artery. A single cut, very precise, would have caused unconsciousness within seconds and death within a minute or 2. The other 2 are more difficult to determine with certainty, given the extent of the dissection, but I believe they died similarly. Quick, efficient kills, followed by post-mortem dissection. So they were dead before he began taking them apart? I believe so, yes. There's no evidence of restraints, no signs they were conscious during the dissection. I think he killed them quickly, then spent hours, perhaps days, performing the anatomical work. Abilene felt a small measure of relief. At least the victims had not suffered the full horror of what was done to them. But it raised another question. Why kill them at all? If his purpose was anatomical study, he could have used cadavers from the anatomy schools, bodies that were already dead. Phillips removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly, a gesture Abilene recognised as the surgeon's way of organising his thoughts. "I've been considering that question. The legal supply of bodies for anatomical study is limited and regulated. Medical schools have waiting lists, and the bodies they do receive are typically those of the very poor, the elderly, the diseased. These victims were young and healthy, perfect specimens if one's goal was to study normal human anatomy. You're suggesting he killed them specifically to obtain good anatomical subjects? I'm suggesting it's one possibility. Another is that the anatomical work was secondary to some other motive. Perhaps he kills for reasons we don't understand, and the dissection is how he memorializes or processes what he's done. Or perhaps he's conducting some form of research that requires fresh specimens." Abilene walked slowly around the examination tables, forcing himself to look at what remained of 3 human beings. Phillips had done his best to treat them with dignity, covering what he could, working with professional detachment. But the horror of what had been done to them was inescapable. Can you determine their identities? Difficult. The most recent victim still has an intact face, and I've taken photographs. If someone reports her missing, we may be able to make an identification. The other 2, Philip shook his head. Extensive decomposition and the removal of identifying features make it nearly impossible. We might be able to determine approximate age, height, build, but specific identity would require someone to recognize personal effects or clothing. What about the jars? The preserved organs? I've examined several of them. They're properly preserved in what appears to be a formalin solution, the kind of thing you'd find in a medical school or research laboratory. Each jar is carefully labelled with anatomical terminology. Liver, female, age approximately 25 years, and so forth. Whoever did this was documenting his work, creating a collection. Abilene felt his disgust deepening. A collection? He's keeping trophies? Or specimens for study? In medical schools, preserved organs are used for teaching. Students examine them to understand anatomy and pathology. Perhaps our killer considers himself a student, or a teacher. The detective left the mortuary shortly afterward, his mind churning with dark possibilities. He walked along the Euston Road, barely noticing the traffic of carriages and pedestrians, trying to build a picture of the man he was hunting. Dr. Thomas Morton, if that was his name, was likely between 35 and 50 years old, based on the description provided by Mrs. Brayhoff Hartley. He was educated, well-spoken, capable of presenting himself as a respectable professional. He possessed extensive medical knowledge and surgical skill. He was patient and methodical, capable of spending hours or days on his anatomical work. He felt no apparent remorse or horror at what he was doing. The careful labelling of jars, the neat arrangement of body parts, suggested someone who viewed this as work, as something to be done properly and thoroughly. And he was still free, still somewhere in London, possibly already selecting his next victim. Aberlin returned to Scotland Yard and found a message waiting from Sergeant Godley. One of the surgical supply houses in the Strand had reported a customer matching Morton's description, who had purchased a substantial quantity of medical instruments and supplies in January, paying in cash. The shopkeeper remembered him because the order was large and because the customer had displayed detailed knowledge of anatomy and surgical procedures. It was the first solid lead. Aberlin and Godley went immediately to the shop, a narrow establishment wedged between a bookseller and a chemist on the Strand. The proprietor, a Mr. Henry Blackwell, was a thin, nervous man who became more nervous when he understood why the police were interested in his customer. He came in late January, Blackwell said, consulting his ledger, ordered a complete set of surgical instruments, scalpels, forceps, bone saws, probes, also purchased glass specimen jars, formalin, anatomical charts, said he was establishing a private practice and needed to outfit his surgery. Can you describe him? Tall gentleman, well-dressed, dark hair and beard, spoke like an educated man, knew the proper names for all the instruments. I assumed he was a legitimate physician. I didn't... Blackwell's voice broke. I didn't know he was going to use them for murder. Did he give a name, an address? Dr. T. Morton. Said he was temporarily lodging in Bloomsbury while looking for permanent premises. Paid in cash, so I didn't ask for further details. Did he mention where he had trained? What medical school? Blackwell shook his head. We didn't discuss personal details. It was simply a business transaction. Aberlin pressed for more information, but Blackwell had little else to offer. The transaction had been unremarkable, the customer professional and courteous. There was nothing that would have raised suspicion at the time. Another dead end. Morton had been careful to leave no trail, to provide false information, to pay in cash that couldn't be traced. Over the following days, the investigation expanded across London. Hundreds of police officers were deployed to search for Morton, to interview anyone who might have seen him, to follow up on the endless stream of tips and sightings that flooded into Scotland Yard. But Morton had vanished as completely as his victims had. No one matching his description appeared in the records of London's medical schools. No one by that name held a medical licence. The letter of reference from Calcutta was confirmed as a forgery. No such medical society existed at the address provided. Dr. Thomas Morton, the lodger who had spent 2 months in room 7 of number 47 Baker Street, had never existed. He was a fiction, a mask worn by someone whose real identity remained unknown. And somewhere in London's 4 million inhabitants, that someone continued to walk free, invisible among the crowds, perhaps already preparing for his next victim, continuing the work that he had promised would go on. In Chapter 4, The Anatomy of Horror, Dr. George Bagster Phillips had been a police surgeon for 23 years. He had examined the bodies of men who died in factory accidents, their limbs torn away by machinery. He had performed post-mortems on women who perished in childbirth, their bodies ravaged by complications no physician could prevent. He had documented the injuries of children beaten to death by drunken parents, of prostitutes strangled in dark alleys, of workers crushed beneath collapsing buildings. Death in Victorian London came in countless forms, and Phillips had witnessed most of them. He had learned to approach his work with professional detachment, to see bodies not as people, but as evidence, as puzzles to be solved through careful examination and scientific method. But the victims from Baker Street troubled him in ways he had not experienced before. It was not simply the horror of what had been done to them, though that was considerable. It was the nature of the work itself, the skill, the knowledge, the terrible care that had been invested in the dissections. Whoever had done this was not a monster in the conventional sense, not someone whose actions were driven by rage or madness or uncontrolled impulse. This was someone who thought like a physician, who worked like a surgeon. who approached the human body with the same careful precision that Phillips himself employed in his examinations. The realization was deeply disturbing. It suggested that medical knowledge, the knowledge meant to heal and preserve life, could be turned to such purposes, that the same skills taught in London's finest teaching hospitals could be used not to save patients, but to dissect them. Phillips had spent several days examining the 3 victims, documenting every aspect of their remains, attempting to extract whatever information might help identify them or catch their killer. He worked alone in the mortuary, preferring privacy for such work, disturbed only by occasional visits from Inspector Aberline. The most recent victim, the one whose face remained intact, had been a woman of approximately 25 years. She stood about 5 feet 4 inches tall, with brown hair and regular features. Her hands showed no signs of heavy labour, no calluses, no permanently stained fingers. This suggested she had not been a factory worker or a laundress, perhaps a shop girl or a domestic servant in a household where the work was not too demanding. Her clothing, what remained of it, was of decent quality, not expensive, but respectable. A simple dress of dark wool, undergarments of cotton, boots that were well made though worn. She had been dressed for walking through the city, not for evening entertainment or seduction. Phillips had taken detailed photographs of her face from multiple angles. These would be circulated to police divisions across London, shown to anyone who reported a missing woman matching the description. It was a painstaking process, but it was the only way to identify victims who carried no papers, no letters, nothing that revealed their names. The cause of death was clear. The killer had approached from behind, Phillips could tell from the angle of the cut, and had drawn a very sharp blade across the throat, severing the carotid artery and the jugular vein simultaneously. Death would have followed within a minute, possibly less. The victim would have lost consciousness almost immediately as blood pressure dropped catastrophically. It was an efficient killing, the kind taught to soldiers and to surgeons who needed to dispatch animals humanely. A single motion, properly executed, and life ended before pain could even register fully. After death, the killer had laid the body on the floor of room 7 and begun his work. The dissection had been performed in stages, Phillips determined. First, a long incision from the base of the throat down to the pubic bone, opening the chest and abdominal cavities. Then the careful removal of the sternum and ribs, cut through with a bone saw, and lifted away to expose the internal organs. Each organ had been examined in place, then carefully removed. The heart first, then the lungs, then the liver, stomach, intestines, kidneys, reproductive organs. Each one placed in a glass jar with preservative, each jar labelled with anatomical terminology that was precise and correct. The work had taken hours, Phillips estimated, perhaps an entire night. The killer had worked by lamplight in the locked room, patient and methodical, undisturbed by any fear of discovery. The second victim had received similar treatment, though the dissection was even more extensive. Not only had the organs been removed, but the muscles had been separated from the bones, each major muscle group carefully dissected and documented. The skeleton itself had been disarticulated, every joint separated, the bones cleaned and laid out in perfect anatomical order. This level of dissection required not just skill, but stamina. Phillips estimated it would have taken days to complete. The killer must have worked in shifts, perhaps leaving the room to eat and rest, then returning to continue his anatomical studies. The third victim, the oldest of the 3 based on bone structure, had been reduced almost to a teaching specimen. Phillips had seen similar preparations in medical schools, anatomical displays where every structure of the human body was exposed and labelled for students to examine. This victim had been opened, explored, documented and arranged as if for a lecture hall. What made it more disturbing was the quality of the work. Phillips had seen autopsy dissections performed by the best surgeons in London, men who had trained at Guy's and St Bartholomew's, who taught anatomy to medical students. The work in room 7 matched their standard. In some ways, it exceeded it. The cuts were clean and precise, following the natural planes of tissue rather than hacking through randomly. The joints had been separated at the correct anatomical points. The organs had been removed without unnecessary damage. Even the labelling on the jars showed medical accuracy. Right lung, adult female, normal appearance, and similar notations that would not have been out of place in a university collection. Phillips compiled his findings into a detailed report for Inspector Aberline. He included measurements, photographs, diagrams showing the nature of the dissections. He listed the instruments that must have been used, the techniques employed, the time required, and he concluded with an assessment that he knew would trouble the detective. The killer was almost certainly someone with formal medical training. Not a medical student who had attended a few anatomy lectures, but someone who had completed substantial surgical education. Someone who had spent years studying the human body, who had performed dissections many times before, who was intimately familiar with anatomical structures. This could be a physician, though hopefully not one currently in practice. It could be a surgeon who had retired or been dismissed. It could be an anatomist from one of the universities. It could be someone who had trained for medicine but never completed certification, or who had been struck off the medical register for some violation. The pool of possible suspects was limited. Perhaps a few thousand men in all of Britain who possessed the necessary knowledge and skill. But identifying which one had become a killer would require access to medical school records, hospital employment histories, professional licensing databases, and even then, if the killer was using a false identity, the search might never succeed. Phillips delivered his report to Scotland Yard on the 20th of March, 6 days after the discovery at Baker Street. He found Aberline in the CID offices, surrounded by files and documents, looking exhausted and frustrated. "The victims haven't been identified," Aberline said after reading the report. "We've shown the photographs to hundreds of people. We've checked missing persons reports going back 6 months. No matches. These women vanished without anyone reporting them gone." "That suggests they were transient," Phillips observed. "New arrivals to London, perhaps. Or women living alone without family or close connections. The kind of people whose absence wouldn't be immediately noticed. Which makes them perfect victims for someone like Morton. He could select them carefully. Women who wouldn't be missed, whose disappearance wouldn't trigger an investigation." Phillips sat down heavily in the chair across from Aberline's desk. "I need to tell you something that's been troubling me. About the nature of the dissections. Go on. They weren't just skillful, they were pedagogical. They were arranged as if for teaching purposes. The way the bodies were positioned, the way the organs were displayed, the labelling of the specimens. It all suggests someone who was trying to demonstrate anatomy, to create educational materials." Aberline frowned. "You think he was teaching someone? That there might be an accomplice?" "No, I think he was teaching himself, or perhaps documenting his own learning. Some medical students create their own anatomical preparations to aid their studies. They'll dissect a body part, a hand perhaps, or a leg, and carefully separate all the structures to understand how they relate to each other. What we found in room 7 is an extension of that practice, but taken to an extreme. So he's using murder victims as study materials. It's one possibility. Another is that he's obsessed with anatomical perfection, with understanding the human body completely. He might see the killing as secondary to the anatomical work, merely a means of obtaining specimens." The detective rubbed his temples. "That's somehow even more disturbing. At least if he were killing from rage or sexual compulsion, we'd understand the motive. But this is something else entirely." Phillips nodded. "I've been researching historical cases. There have been other killers who performed anatomical work on their victims, though none I've found approached this level of skill. But there's a documented phenomenon in medical literature. Some physicians and anatomists become so fascinated by the structure of the human body that they lose sight of its humanity. They begin to see people as specimens, as objects for study, rather than as living beings. Is there a term for this? Not in any official diagnostic sense, but some alienists, what we now call psychiatrists, have written about what they call anatomical obsession, the belief that by thoroughly understanding the physical structure of the body, one can understand the nature of life itself. It's a kind of materialism taken to its logical extreme." Aberline was quiet for a moment. Outside the office windows, the sounds of London filtered through. The rattle of carriages, the calls of street vendors, the distant whistle of a locomotive. The ordinary sounds of a vast city going about its business, oblivious to the horror being investigated in this small room. "So we're looking for a man with medical training who has become obsessed with anatomy, to the point where he sees nothing wrong with murdering people to study them." "That would be my assessment, yes. And such a man would be very difficult to identify through conventional means. He might appear perfectly normal in every other aspect of his life. He might have friends, colleagues, perhaps even patients if he's still practicing, The obsession might manifest only in private when he's alone with his specimens. How do we catch someone like that? Phillips had no answer. The traditional methods of criminal investigation relied on witnesses, physical evidence, patterns of behaviour that revealed the criminal's identity. But Morton had left no witnesses, minimal evidence, and his pattern was one of careful planning and execution that suggested he could continue indefinitely without making a mistake. "You'll need to think like him," Phillips said finally. "Understand what drives him. If anatomy is his obsession, then he'll need to feed that obsession. He'll need more specimens, more opportunities to study. Perhaps there's a way to use that against him." After Phillips left, Abberlin sat alone in his office and thought about what the surgeon had said. He had investigated dozens of murders during his career, and in every case, understanding the motive had been key to solving the crime. A man who killed for money could be traced through financial records. A man who killed from jealousy left a trail of relationships and grudges. A man who killed from rage or revenge revealed himself through his connections to the victim. But a man who killed to obtain anatomical specimens was something new. The motive was almost abstract, intellectual rather than emotional. The victims were interchangeable, selected not for who they were but for what they represented. Fresh, healthy specimens for study. How did one catch such a killer? Abberlin pulled out a map of London and marked the location of Baker Street. Then he began marking the locations where women had been reported missing over the past 6 months. The marks scattered across the map like a disease: Whitechapel, Suffolk, Clerkenwell, Lambeth, Westminster. No obvious pattern emerged. The disappearances were spread throughout London, affecting all districts equally. But as he studied the map, something occurred to him. Medical schools and teaching hospitals had specific locations: Guy's Hospital in Suffolk, St Bartholomew's near Smithfield, the London Hospital in Whitechapel, St Thomas's near Westminster Bridge, University College Hospital in Bloomsbury. If Morton was connected to the medical profession, he might operate near these institutions. He might select victims from areas where medical students and physicians were common, where his presence wouldn't attract attention. Abberlin began marking the locations of medical institutions on his map. And as he did so, a pattern began to emerge. Many of the missing women had last been seen within a few streets of major hospitals or medical schools. It wasn't proof, it wasn't even strong evidence, but it was a direction, a way of narrowing the search. He called for Sergeant Godley and showed him the map. "I want every medical school and hospital in London contacted. Get lists of all staff, all students, all researchers who have access to anatomical facilities. Cross-reference with our description of Morton. Look for anyone who matches: tall, dark hair, educated, between 35 and 50 years old. That could be hundreds of men, sir. Then we'll investigate hundreds of men. Someone knows Morton, or has worked with him, or has noticed something unusual about him. Medical training leaves records, applications, transcripts, employment histories. We find those records, we find connections, we narrow the field." It was tedious work, the kind of systematic investigation that would take weeks or months, but Abberlin had no better ideas. They were hunting a ghost who left almost no traces, who operated with extraordinary care and discipline. The only way to catch such a man was through patient, methodical police work. The investigation continued through the last days of March. Detectives visited every medical institution in London, requesting records, interviewing staff, searching for anyone who matched the description of Dr. Thomas Morton. The work was slow and frustrating, hampered by institutional resistance. Medical schools were protective of their reputations and reluctant to admit that one of their own might be a killer. But gradually, leads began to emerge. A surgeon at St Thomas's remembered a colleague who had been dismissed several years before for conducting unauthorised dissections. A medical student at Guy's reported a former classmate who had been obsessed with anatomy to an unhealthy degree. A hospital administrator in Whitechapel recalled a physician who had resigned suddenly and whose current whereabouts were unknown. Each lead was followed, each name investigated. Most proved to be false trails. The surgeon had moved to Edinburgh and could be accounted for. The medical student was working in a country practice. The physician had emigrated to Australia. But the investigation was beginning to narrow the field, to identify men who had the skills and opportunity to be the Baker Street butcher. And then, in early April, a break came from an unexpected source. A woman came forward to Scotland Yard claiming she had information about the murders. Her name was Sarah Collins, and she had a story to tell about a lodger she had once rented a room to, a man who called himself Dr. Morton, and a discovery she had made that had driven her to flee her own house in terror. Chapter 5. The pattern reveals itself. Sarah Collins was a widow of 43 years who operated a small lodging house in Clerkenwell, a working-class district northeast of the City of London. She arrived at Scotland Yard on the afternoon of April 3rd, carrying a worn carpet bag and wearing the anxious expression of someone who had spent days debating whether to come forward. Detective Inspector Abeline received her in one of the interview rooms, a small space with a table, 2 chairs, and a window that looked out over the Thames. Sergeant Godley sat in the corner, notebook ready, while Abeline settled himself across from Mrs. Beoft, Collins, and waited for her to speak. She was a thin woman with greying hair pulled back in a severe bun, dressed in black mourning clothes that had seen better days. Her hands twisted nervously in her lap as she began her story. "I saw the newspapers," she said quietly, "about the murders in Baker Street, about the lodger who called himself Dr. Morton, and I thought I should tell someone what happened at my house, what I found after he left." Abeline leaned forward slightly. "Take your time, Mrs. Collins. Tell me everything from the beginning." She took a breath and began. In December of the previous year, 1872, a gentleman had come to her lodging house inquiring about rooms. He introduced himself as Dr. Thomas Morton, recently returned from medical practice abroad, seeking temporary accommodation while he established himself in London. He was well-spoken, respectably dressed, and offered to pay a month's rent in advance. "Did he match the description that's been in the newspapers?" Abeline asked. "Tall, dark hair and beard, educated manner." "Yes, exactly so. I thought him a perfect gentleman. He took the room on the 2nd floor, said he needed quiet for his studies. He had medical books, he said, and would sometimes need to work late into the night." Morton had lived in her house for approximately 6 weeks, from early December through mid-January. During that time, he had been an ideal tenant in most respects. Quiet, paid his rent promptly, caused no disturbances. But there had been oddities that troubled Mrs. Collins even then. He kept irregular hours, sometimes absent for days. Other times locked in his room for extended periods. He refused to allow the maid to clean his quarters, saying he preferred to maintain them himself. And there were smells. Chemical odours that drifted under the door, smells like the formaldehyde used by undertakers, smells that reminded Mrs. Collins of the hospital where her late husband had died. Did he have visitors? Receive correspondence? Never, sir. No one ever called for him. No letters arrived. He was entirely solitary. In mid-January, Morton had given notice that he would be leaving. He paid what he owed, thanked Mrs. Collins for her hospitality, and departed one morning with his trunks and cases, leaving no forwarding address. Mrs. Collins had entered the room after his departure to prepare it for the next tenant. What she found there had troubled her deeply, though at the time she had not understood its full significance. The room had been thoroughly cleaned. Morton had stripped it bare, scrubbed the floors, wiped down every surface. But in the fireplace, among the ashes, she had found fragments of clothing. Women's clothing, a piece of dress fabric partially burned, a scrap of petticoat, part of a boot that had not been entirely consumed by the flames. "I thought perhaps he'd had a woman visiting him secretly," Mrs. Collins said, "that perhaps he was married and trying to hide evidence of an affair. It seemed sordid, but not criminal." But there was more. In the corner of the room, Morton had left behind a small wooden crate, pushed against the wall and partially hidden by a curtain. Mrs. Collins had opened it, expecting to find books or papers he had forgotten. Inside were glass jars, 6 of them, each containing what appeared to be preserved organs in cloudy fluid. They were labelled in neat handwriting with medical terminology she didn't understand. "I was horrified," Mrs. Collins said, her voice shaking at the memory. "I thought perhaps they were medical specimens, things a doctor might keep for study, but something about them felt wrong. The way they were hidden, the burned clothing in the fireplace. I became frightened." She had closed the crate immediately and pushed it back into the corner, then fled the room. She told herself it was nothing, that doctors often kept anatomical specimens, that there was a reasonable explanation. But the fear remained, growing over the following weeks. when the newspapers began reporting the Baker Street murders, describing the lodger named Dr. Kias, Morton, and the preserved organs found in his room, Mrs. Collins had realised with horror that the man who had stayed in her house might be the same person. "I brought the crate with me," she said, gesturing to the carpet bag at her feet. "I couldn't bear to have it in my house any longer. I should have come forward sooner, but I was afraid. Afraid of what it might mean, afraid of being involved in something so terrible." Abeline asked her to retrieve the crate. She pulled it from the bag, a simple wooden box perhaps 18 inches on each side with a hinged lid. She placed it on the table between them with obvious reluctance. The detective opened it carefully. Inside, nested in straw packing, were 6 glass jars of various sizes. Each contained a preserved organ suspended in preservative fluid. Each was labelled in precise handwriting: kidney, female, age approximately 30 years. Liver, female, normal tissue. Section of intestine, female, showing normal structure. Abeline felt his stomach tighten. The jars were identical to those found at Baker Street. The handwriting appeared to be the same. The labelling used the same medical terminology, the same format. "Mrs. Collins, you've done the right thing by coming forward," he said quietly. "This is crucial evidence. Can you tell me the exact address of your lodging house?" "Number 23 Middleton Street, Clerkenwell." Abeline looked at Godley, who was already making notes. Clerkenwell was northeast of Baker Street, perhaps 2 miles distant. If Morton had been operating from Mrs. Collins's house before moving to Baker Street, it suggested he was moving through London, changing locations regularly to avoid detection. "Did Morton give any indication of where he planned to go after leaving your house?" Mrs. Collins shook her head. "He said only that he had found more suitable accommodation. He thanked me for my hospitality and left. I never saw him again." After Mrs. Collins departed, leaving the crate and its contents as evidence, Abeline and Godley examined the jars more closely. The preservation was excellent. The organs showed no signs of decomposition, suggesting they had been prepared by someone with substantial knowledge of anatomical preservation techniques. "This confirms what Dr. Phillips suspected," Godley said. "Morton is collecting specimens, keeping them as some kind of anatomical collection. But why? What's the purpose?" "That's what we need to understand," Abeline replied. "If we can determine his purpose, we might be able to predict where he'll strike next." They spread a large map of London on the table and marked 2 locations: Clerkenwell, where Morton had lodged from December to January, and Baker Street, where he had lived from January to March. 2 points, several miles apart in different districts of the city. "He's moving westward," Godley observed, "from the working-class areas toward the more respectable districts. Or he's simply moving to avoid detection, changing locations every few months before anyone becomes too suspicious of his activities." Abeline studied the map, thinking. If Morton followed the same pattern, he would have left Baker Street after the discovery became imminent. He had departed on or around March 11th, 3 days before the bodies were found. That gave him time to establish himself elsewhere, to rent new accommodations under a new name or perhaps the same name in a different district, where landlords wouldn't have heard the news. "We need to check lodging houses across London," Abeline said. "Focus on areas west and north of Baker Street. Look for a man matching Morton's description who took rooms in mid-March, who pays in cash, who keeps irregular hours and refuses maid service. That could be hundreds of lodging houses, sir. Then we'll check hundreds. And while we're doing that, I want to revisit the missing persons reports. Mrs. Collins said Morton was in her house from December to January. If he killed victims during that period, there should be disappearances from the Clerkenwell area that match our timeline." Over the following days, the investigation expanded in multiple directions. Detectives canvassed lodging houses throughout West and North London, showing Morton's description, asking about new tenants. Godley coordinated with police divisions to compile missing persons reports from December through March, organising them by location and date. And slowly, a pattern began to emerge. In December, 3 women had been reported missing from the Clerkenwell and Finsbury areas, districts adjacent to where Mrs. Collins's lodging house was located. All 3 were young women between 20 and 30 years old. All 3 had vanished without trace, leaving behind their few possessions never to be seen again. In January, 2 more women had disappeared, this time from areas closer to Baker Street, Marylebone and St Pancras. Again, young women with no family, No close connections, the kind who could vanish without triggering immediate investigation. In February, another 3 disappearances, all from districts within a mile of Baker Street. And in early March, before Morton had left Baker Street, 2 final disappearances from the Paddington area, just west of Marylebone. 10 women, Godley said, spreading the reports across Abeline's desk. Possibly 11 if we include one disappearance that's less certain, all from areas where Morton was living or might have been operating, all young, all without strong family connections, all vanished completely. Abeline felt a cold certainty settling over him. They had found only 3 bodies at Baker Street, but Morton had likely killed many more. The jars left at Mrs. Collins's house represented additional victims. And if the pattern of disappearances was accurate, Morton had been killing steadily for months, perhaps longer. "We're not dealing with 3 murders," Abeline said quietly. "We're dealing with a serial killer who's been operating across London, selecting victims systematically, killing them for anatomical specimens, and moving regularly to avoid detection. The term serial killer would not be coined for another century, but the concept was beginning to take shape in Abeline's mind. This was not a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was methodical, repetitive murder, carried out over an extended period according to a pattern. Dr. Phillips was consulted again and asked to examine the jars from Mrs. Collins's house. His conclusion was unequivocal. The organs were human, recently harvested, and preserved using professional techniques. The handwriting on the labels matched that found on the jars at Baker Street. "We're likely looking at 6 additional victims minimum," Phillips told Abeline. 6 women who died to provide these specimens, and there may be more we haven't discovered yet. The investigation intensified. Scotland Yard assigned every available detective to the case. Police divisions across London were put on alert. The newspapers, which had been following the case obsessively, published daily updates and wild speculation about the killer's identity and motives. The public response was a mixture of fear and fascination. Women changed their habits drastically. Many refused to go out after dark, refused to walk alone, refused to accept employment that would leave them vulnerable. Lodging houses became more cautious about their tenants, requiring references and detailed information before letting rooms, but London was vast and Morton was skilled at blending in, at presenting himself as respectable and unthreatening. He had successfully rented rooms multiple times using the same false identity. There was no reason to believe he couldn't do so again. On April 10th, a potential break came from an unexpected source. A medical supply shopkeeper in Bloomsbury came forward to report that a customer matching Morton's description had purchased additional supplies in late March. More glass jars, more preservative chemicals, more surgical instruments. He said he'd broken some equipment and needed replacements, the shopkeeper reported, paid in cash, gave the name Dr. J. Anderson. Said he was conducting private anatomical research. J. Anderson. A different name, but the same pattern, a medical title, a common surname that would be difficult to trace, payment in cash to avoid leaving records. The shopkeeper provided an address where the supplies were to be delivered, a lodging house in Bloomsbury, not far from the British Museum. Abeline and a team of constables went there immediately, arriving to find a respectable boarding establishment operated by an elderly couple. Yes, they had a lodger by the name of Dr. Anderson. He had taken rooms 3 weeks ago. Quiet gentleman, kept to himself, paid his rent promptly. He was out at present, they said, but was expected to return that evening. Abeline made a decision. They would wait. They would watch the house and arrest Anderson, or Morton, or whatever his real name was, when he returned. After months of investigation, after 10 or more victims, they finally had a location, a chance to end this nightmare. Plainclothes detectives took up positions around the building. Constables in uniform were stationed at nearby corners, ready to respond if needed. Abeline himself waited in a room across the street, watching the entrance through field glasses, determined not to let this opportunity slip away. Hours passed. Evening came, bringing with it the familiar London fog that rolled up from the Thames and reduced visibility to a few yards. Gas lamps were lit, casting yellow pools of light in the gloom. The city settled into its evening rhythms. Theatres opening, public houses filling, the streets gradually emptying as respectable people returned to their homes. At 8:30, a tall figure emerged from the fog, walking purposefully toward the lodging house. He wore a dark coat and carried a leather medical bag. His face was partially obscured by the fog and the dim light. but his build and manner matched the descriptions they had collected. "That's him," Abberlin said quietly to Godley. "Send the signal." Godley moved to the window and waved a handkerchief, the prearranged signal for the constables to move in. The detectives positioned around the building began to converge on the entrance. The man in the dark coat reached the door of the lodging house and paused, his hand on the handle. For a moment he seemed to hesitate, as if sensing something wrong. Then he turned slightly, looking up and down the street. And in that moment, he saw them. Saw the constables approaching from both directions, saw the detective emerging from the doorway across the street. His body went rigid with recognition and understanding. Then he ran. He bolted into the fog, the medical bag still clutched in his hand, moving with surprising speed and agility. The constables shouted and gave chase, their whistles shrilling in the night air. Abberlin ran after them, his heart pounding, determined not to lose this man after months of hunting. The chase led through the maze of streets around Bloomsbury, through alleys and courts, past startled pedestrians and confused bystanders. The fog hampered both pursued and pursuers, turning the chase into a nightmare of confused pursuit through shifting grey curtains that revealed and concealed by turns. The suspect was fast and knew the streets well, turning corners abruptly, doubling back, trying to lose his pursuers in the labyrinth of London's back streets. But the constables were younger and in better physical condition, and there were many of them. They spread out, covering multiple routes, coordinating with whistles and shouts. Finally, in a narrow court off Russell Street, the suspect found himself trapped. Constables blocked both exits. There was no escape. He turned to face them, his back against a brick wall, breathing heavily. In the dim light from a nearby gas lamp, Abberlin could see his face clearly for the first time. He was indeed a man in his 40s, tall and lean, with dark hair and beard going grey. His eyes were intelligent and alert, showing not fear but a kind of cold calculation, as if he were assessing options and finding them all inadequate. "Dr. Morton, I presume," Abberlin said, approaching carefully. "Or should I call you Dr. Anderson? Or perhaps you'd like to give us your real name?" The man said nothing. He simply stared at Abberlin with an expression that was difficult to read. Not defiance exactly, nor remorse, but something else. A kind of clinical interest, as if he were examining a specimen rather than facing arrest for murder. "You're under arrest for the murders of multiple women," Abberlin continued. "I must warn you that anything you say may be used as evidence against you." The man smiled slightly, though there was no warmth in it. "You don't understand," he said quietly. His voice was educated, cultured, exactly as the witnesses had described. "You can't possibly understand the work I was doing, the knowledge I was gaining. The contributions to anatomical science. We understand that you murdered at least 10 women," Abberlin said coldly. "That's all we need to understand." "They were nobody," the man said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Street women, servants, the kind who vanish every day and no one notices. I gave their deaths meaning. I made them serve a purpose." Abberlin felt his disgust rising, but kept his voice level. "What is your real name?" The man was silent for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "Dr. Henry Blackwood. I was trained at Guy's Hospital, practiced surgery for 15 years before I discovered my true calling." "Your calling being the murder and dissection of innocent women?" "My calling being the pursuit of perfect anatomical knowledge," Blackwood corrected. "The human body is the most complex machine in existence, Inspector. To truly understand it requires complete examination, careful study, proper preservation of specimens. The medical schools are too limited, too constrained by ethics and regulations. I was conducting pure research, unhampered by such restrictions." "Take him," Abberlin said to the constables, unable to listen further. "Take him to Scotland Yard, and search his rooms immediately. I want every piece of evidence collected and documented." As the constables moved forward to place manacles on Blackwood's wrists, the doctor looked at Abberlin with that same clinical expression. "The work continues, Inspector," he said quietly. "Even after I'm gone, the work continues. You can stop me, but you cannot stop what I've discovered. The knowledge exists now. It's been recorded, documented, preserved. Others will follow where I've led." Then he was led away into the fog, and Abberlin was left standing in the narrow court, feeling not triumph, but a deep unease at those final words. The work continues. It was the same message that had been carved into the mantelpiece at Baker Street. and now Abilene understood it was not a threat but a statement of belief. The belief that Blackwood's anatomical obsession had transcended individual life and death, had become something larger and more terrible than any single killer. Chapter 6. The Hunt Through London. The arrest of Dr. Henry Blackwood was reported in every newspaper in London by the following morning. The headlines screamed triumph and relief. The Baker Street butcher captured anatomy murderer, arrested after dramatic chase. Scotland Yard ends reign of terror, but for Detective Inspector Abilene, the arrest was only the beginning of a much larger and more disturbing investigation. Blackwood had been caught, but the full extent of his crimes remained unknown, and his final words, "The work continues," suggested there might be more to discover, more victims to identify, perhaps even evidence that others had been involved. The search of Blackwood's rooms in Bloomsbury began immediately after his arrest. A team of detectives and constables entered the lodging house on the evening of April 10th and worked through the night, carefully documenting and collecting everything they found. What they discovered was both horrifying and illuminating. Blackwood had transformed his rented rooms into a personal anatomical laboratory. The furniture had been rearranged to create a workspace. A large table stood in the centre of the main room, its surface stained with substances that were clearly organic in nature. Surgical instruments were arranged on a smaller side table. Scalpels, saws, forceps, probes, all cleaned and ready for use. Glass jars lined shelves along one wall, 37 in total, each containing preserved organs and tissue samples. Each jar was labelled with the same precise handwriting seen at Baker Street and Clerkenwell, documenting the specimen's origin and characteristics. But most disturbing were the notebooks. Blackwood had kept detailed records of his work, filling volume after volume with observations, sketches, measurements, and analytical notes. The notebooks were organised chronologically, dating back more than 2 years, suggesting Blackwood had been killing far longer than the investigators had initially suspected. Abilene spent the following days reading through these notebooks, forcing himself to confront the methodical horror they contained. Blackwood wrote in a clear, precise hand, using medical terminology throughout, describing his activities as if they were legitimate research rather than serial murder. The first entries dated to January 1871, more than 2 years before the Baker Street discovery. They describe Blackwood's growing dissatisfaction with his medical practice, his belief that conventional medicine was limited by ethical constraints that prevented true understanding of human anatomy. The cadavers available through legal channels are insufficient, one entry read. They are the bodies of the old, the diseased, the malnourished. To truly understand optimal human structure, one requires young, healthy specimens. The medical schools cannot provide these, and so I must obtain them through other means. Subsequent entries documented what Blackwood called his methodology. He described how he selected victims, women between 20 and 35 years old in good health, without family connections or steady employment. Women who lived on the margins of society, who could disappear without triggering immediate investigation. The key is patience, one entry noted. Observe potential subjects carefully. Learn their habits, their roots, their vulnerabilities. Approach only when conditions are optimal. Isolated location. Late hour. Minimal risk of witnesses. The application of chloroform renders them unconscious within seconds, preventing struggle or outcry. From that point, the work can proceed at leisure. Chloroform. That explained the lack of defensive wounds that had puzzled Dr. Phillips. Blackwood had been using anaesthetic to subdue his victims before killing them. It was almost surgical in its precision. The same chemical used to render patients unconscious before operations was being employed for murder. The notebooks contained detailed anatomical drawings of extraordinary quality. Blackwood had sketched each victim multiple times during the dissection process, documenting the position of organs, the structure of muscles, the articulation of joints. The drawings were accurate enough to be used in medical textbooks, showing a level of artistic skill that matched his surgical abilities. But most chilling were the personal observations. Blackwood occasionally wrote about his victims as individuals, noting details about their lives before he killed them. One entry mentioned a young woman who had told him she hoped to save enough money to return to her family in the countryside. Another described a seamstress who had shown him photographs of her sister's children. These entries suggested Blackwood had spent time with his victims before killing them, had conversations with them, learned about their hopes and dreams, and then he had murdered them with the same clinical detachment he might have shown in slaughtering laboratory animals. Subject displays normal emotional responses, one entry read. Fear when approached in isolated location, relief when offered assistance, trust when medical credentials mentioned. The ease with which subjects can be manipulated suggests fundamental vulnerability in human psychology. We are programmed to trust those who present themselves as helpers, even when such trust may be fatal. Abelin found these passages almost unbearable. Blackwood had not only killed these women, but had studied their psychological responses, had treated their fear and trust as data points in his research. He had been conducting experiments not just on dead tissue but on living people, observing how they reacted in their final moments. The notebooks identified at least 14 specific victims, described in enough detail that investigators could attempt to match them to missing persons reports. But there were also references to preliminary subjects and early experiments that suggested additional victims Blackwood had not bothered to document fully. Dr. Phillips was brought in to examine the preserved specimens found in Blackwood's rooms. His conclusion was that they represented at least 8 different individuals, confirming that many more victims existed beyond the 3 found at Baker Street. "We may never know the full count," Phillips told Abeline grimly. "He's been killing for at least 2 years, possibly longer. He moved frequently, used different names, left minimal records. Some of his victims may have been disposed of without any preservation of specimens. We can only count the ones he chose to keep." The question of where Blackwood had conducted his murders was partially answered by the notebooks. He had used multiple locations, sometimes the rooms he rented when he was confident of privacy. Other times he had lured victims to abandoned buildings, empty warehouses, isolated areas where he could work undisturbed. One notebook contained a list of locations Blackwood had scouted for future use. A dozen addresses across London, mostly in working-class areas, places where strange noises or odd smells would not attract immediate attention. Detectives were dispatched to investigate these locations. At 3 of them, they found evidence of Blackwood's activities: bloodstains that had been imperfectly cleaned, chemical residues, in one case a forgotten surgical instrument hidden beneath floorboards. The evidence was overwhelming. Blackwood would certainly hang for his crimes. But Abeline wanted more than a conviction. He wanted to understand how this had happened, how a trained physician had transformed into a serial killer, how someone with the knowledge and skills to heal had chosen instead to murder. Blackwood himself offered no explanations that satisfied the detective. He was interviewed multiple times at Scotland Yard, always in the presence of his solicitor, and his responses were consistent. He felt no remorse, expressed no understanding that what he had done was wrong. He viewed himself as a researcher, his victims as specimens, and his crimes as contributions to medical science. "I've made discoveries," he said during one interview, his tone lecturing, as if explaining to a slow student. "I've documented anatomical variations that no medical text describes. I've preserved specimens of such quality that they could serve educational purposes for decades. Future generations of physicians will benefit from my work." "Future generations will remember you as a monster," Abeline replied coldly. Blackwood smiled slightly. "Monster. Genius. The distinction often depends on perspective and timing. Galileo was condemned by his contemporaries for scientific observations that are now accepted fact. Perhaps in a century my methods will seem less shocking, my contributions more valuable." "You killed at least 14 innocent women." "I utilised 14 specimens in pursuit of knowledge," Blackwood corrected. "Specimens that otherwise would have lived unremarkable lives and died unremarkable deaths, contributing nothing to human understanding. I gave their deaths meaning." Abeline found these conversations exhausting and disturbing. Blackwood appeared genuinely unable to comprehend the moral dimension of what he had done. He understood intellectually that society condemned his actions, but he felt no emotional connection to that condemnation. He was a sociopath, though that term would not be widely used for decades. A man who lacked the capacity for empathy, who saw other people as objects rather than as beings with their own internal experiences. The investigation also sought to understand how Blackwood had managed to operate for so long without detection. Part of the answer lay in his mobility. He had moved frequently, changing locations every few months, never staying long enough for patterns to become obvious. He had used multiple false identities. all variations on the same theme: Dr. Morton, Dr. Anderson, Dr. Thompson. The medical title lent him credibility. The common surnames made him difficult to trace. But there was another factor. Victorian London, for all its size and sophistication, had no centralised system for tracking criminals across different police divisions. Each division maintained its own records, conducted its own investigations, communicated poorly with others. A killer who operated across divisional boundaries could exploit these gaps, committing crimes in multiple areas without any one division recognising the pattern. Blackwood had understood this weakness and had exploited it brilliantly. He had selected victims from different areas, had committed his murders in different divisions, had ensured that no single police station would see enough cases to recognise a pattern. "We were designed to catch common criminals," Abberline said to his superior, Superintendent Thomas Arnold, after weeks of investigation. "Thieves who operate in familiar territory, murderers who kill people they know, criminals whose motives and methods are conventional. We were never designed to catch someone like Blackwood, someone who operates across the entire city, who kills strangers selected almost randomly, who has no conventional motive beyond obsession." Arnold nodded heavily. "The question is whether there are others like him, whether Blackwood is unique or whether he represents a new type of criminal that we'll need to develop new methods to combat." It was a prescient question. Though neither man knew it, the late Victorian era would produce several serial killers whose crimes would shock Britain. Jack the Ripper 15 years later, Neil Cream, Thomas Neal, and others. The anonymity of the growing city, combined with poor communication between police divisions, created opportunities for intelligent killers to operate with relative impunity. But for now, the focus was on ensuring Blackwood faced justice. The trial was scheduled for June 1873 at the Central Criminal Court at Old Bailey. The prosecution was confident. The evidence was overwhelming. The notebooks alone were sufficient to secure a conviction on multiple counts of murder. The defence strategy was to argue insanity, to claim that Blackwood was not responsible for his actions due to mental disease. Alienists, Victorian-era psychiatrists, were brought in to examine Blackwood. Their conclusions were mixed. Some believed he showed signs of moral insanity, a condition where the ethical sense was damaged while intellectual faculties remained intact. Others argued he was perfectly sane, simply evil, and should be held fully responsible for his crimes. The debate over Blackwood's sanity raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil and responsibility. If someone genuinely could not understand that murder was wrong, were they responsible for their actions? Or did the absence of moral sense itself constitute a form of madness that deserved treatment rather than punishment? These were philosophical questions that the Victorian legal system was not well equipped to answer. In the end, the practical outcome was clear. Regardless of whether Blackwood was mad or evil, he was too dangerous to be allowed to live. He would hang, and society would be protected from him. But Aberline could not shake the feeling that executing Blackwood would not truly end this case. The notebooks contained too much information, too many detailed descriptions of anatomical discoveries, too many carefully preserved specimens. What would happen to all that material? Would it be destroyed, sealed in archives? Or would some future researcher, driven by similar obsessions, seek it out and use it as a foundation for their own terrible work? "The work continues," Blackwood had written, and perhaps he was right. Perhaps the knowledge he had gained through murder would persist, would influence others, would become part of the dark undercurrent of medical science that occasionally surfaced in atrocities like human experimentation and anatomical horror. These thoughts troubled Aberline as he prepared his evidence for trial, as he interviewed witnesses, as he worked to ensure that every aspect of the case was documented and preserved. He had caught the killer, yes, but he could not escape the feeling that something larger had been uncovered, something that would not be easily resolved by a trial and an execution. London returned slowly to normal as spring progressed towards summer. Women gradually resumed their usual patterns of movement, though many remained more cautious than they had been before. Lodging houses continued to screen their tenants more carefully. The Metropolitan Police began implementing better systems for sharing information across divisions, learning from the failures that had allowed Blackwood to operate undetected for so long. But beneath the surface normality, unease remained. Blackwood had been caught, but how many others like him might be operating in London's vast sprawl? How many other monsters wore respectable faces, moved through society as trusted professionals, harboured obsessions and compulsions that might someday explode into violence? These were questions without answers, shadows that would haunt Victorian London for decades to come, fears that would be validated repeatedly as other killers emerged from the darkness to shock and horrify the public. For now, though, there was only the methodical work of building a case, preparing for trial, and hoping that justice, when it came, would provide some measure of closure to a city that had been terrorised for far too long. Chapter 7. The Second Scene. The discovery came on the 23rd of April, 10 days after Blackwood's arrest, when investigators believed they had finally accounted for all his crimes. A warehouse worker in Whitechapel, a man named Thomas Briggs, was conducting routine inspections of properties his employer owned throughout the East End. One such property was a disused warehouse on Dorset Street, a narrow thoroughfare in the heart of Spitalfields that had a reputation for poverty, crime and vice. The warehouse had stood empty for more than a year, its previous tenant having gone bankrupt and abandoned the lease. Briggs was checking the building's condition, assessing whether it could be rented again or should be demolished. He carried a lantern as he moved through the dim interior, noting the water damage from leaks in the roof, the broken windows, the debris that had accumulated. On the second floor, in a room at the back of the building, he found the door secured with a heavy padlock. This was unusual. The previous tenant had no reason to lock a single room in an otherwise empty warehouse. Curious, Briggs fetched a crowbar from his tool bag and forced the lock. The smell hit him immediately. Even after weeks or months, the odour of decay and chemicals was overpowering. Briggs covered his nose with his handkerchief and pushed the door open wider, raising his lantern to illuminate the space beyond. What he saw sent him stumbling backward, his stomach heaving. The room had been transformed into something that resembled both a surgical theatre and a charnel house. A large wooden table dominated the centre of the space, its surface deeply stained and gouged. Smaller tables lined the walls, covered with glass jars, bottles of chemicals, surgical instruments arranged with terrible neatness. And along one wall, suspended from hooks like meat in a butcher's shop, were the remains of what had once been human bodies. Briggs fled the building and ran directly to the nearest police station, gasping out his discovery to the startled constables. Within the hour, Detective Inspector Aberline was standing in that second-floor room, lantern held high, surveying a scene that made even the horrors of Baker Street seem almost restrained by comparison. 6 bodies hung along the wall, as in various stages of dissection and preservation. Some were nearly complete, opened and explored but still recognisable as human forms. Others had been reduced to collections of parts, organised by anatomical system. All the bones in one grouping, all the organs in another, the skin and muscles in a third. The level of organisation was extraordinary. Each body part was labelled with a small tag, indicating its origin and characteristics. The glass jars contained dozens of specimens, each one preserved in clear fluid, each one documenting some aspect of human anatomy. Notebooks lay stacked on one of the tables, filled with the same precise handwriting found in Blackwood's other locations. But there were differences here that troubled Aberline deeply. The bodies at Baker Street had been recent victims, killed within weeks or months of discovery. These bodies showed varying stages of decomposition and preservation, suggesting they had been collected over a much longer period. Some appeared to be more than a year old, perhaps 2. And the scale of the operation was far larger than anything Blackwood could have accomplished in the rented rooms where he had been caught. This was a dedicated facility, a place where he could work for extended periods without fear of discovery, where he could pursue his anatomical obsession with no constraints. Dr. Phillips arrived shortly after Aberline and began the grim work of examining the remains. His preliminary assessment was that the bodies represented at least 6 individuals, possibly more if some had been completely dismembered and mixed together. All appeared to be women, all young, all consistent with Blackwood's known victim profile. "This is his primary workshop," Phillips said quietly, standing amid the horror. The rooms he rented were temporary facilities, places where he could kill and do preliminary work, but he brought them here for the detailed anatomical study. This is where the bulk of his research was conducted. Aberline walked slowly around the room, trying to understand the mind that had created this place. The warehouse was isolated, surrounded by other abandoned buildings, in a district where the police rarely patrolled and where strange noises would not attract attention. Blackwood had chosen the location with the same care he applied to everything else. On the tables alongside the surgical instruments and specimen jars were books, medical texts, anatomical atlases, works on surgical technique. But also stranger volumes, medieval manuscripts on dissection, alchemical texts, books on ancient Egyptian mummification practices. Blackwood had been studying not just modern anatomy, but the entire history of human attempts to understand and preserve the body. One notebook in particular caught Aberline's attention. Unlike the others, which documented specific dissections and observations, this one appeared to be a theoretical work. Blackwood had been developing what he called a comprehensive taxonomy of human anatomical variation, attempting to create a system for categorizing and understanding the subtle differences in structure between individuals. "I have observed 43 subjects," one entry read. "Each displays unique characteristics, variations in organ placement, differences in vascular patterns, individual peculiarities in skeletal structure. Medical textbooks present the human body as a standardized form, but this is an oversimplification. Each body is distinct, and only through comprehensive examination of multiple specimens can one understand the true range of human anatomical possibility." 43 subjects. The number struck Aberline like a physical blow. They had known Blackwood had killed at least 14 women. Now it appeared the true count might be 43 or more. Dozens of women vanished from London's streets over a period of years, their bodies ending up in this terrible place, dissected and studied and preserved as specimens in a madman's collection. "We need to search the entire warehouse," Aberline said to the constables who had accompanied him. "Every room, every corner, document everything. And send for more men. This is going to take days." The search revealed additional horrors. In a room on the ground floor, investigators found a collection of clothing, dresses, shawls, boots, undergarments. These were the personal effects of Blackwood's victims, carefully stored and catalogued. Each item bore a tag with a number corresponding to entries in his notebooks. Through these belongings, investigators might finally be able to identify some of the victims, to give names to women who had vanished without trace. In another room, they found what appeared to be a primitive laboratory. Chemical apparatus, bottles of preservatives, acids for cleaning bones, various compounds whose purposes investigators could only guess at. Blackwood had been conducting experiments in preservation, trying to develop methods for keeping anatomical specimens in perfect condition indefinitely. And in a locked cabinet in the corner of the main dissection room, they found photographs. Dozens of them, carefully arranged in albums. Blackwood had documented his victims both before and after death. The photographs showed young women, some smiling uncertainly at the camera, others looking frightened or confused. These were followed by clinical photographs of the same women after death, their bodies opened and arranged for anatomical display. Aberline felt his disgust and horror deepening with each new discovery. Blackwood had not simply killed these women. He had systematically documented every aspect of their existence and destruction, had created what amounted to an encyclopedia of murder, organised and thorough and utterly devoid of human feeling. The investigation of the Dorset Street warehouse continued for more than a week. Detectives worked in shifts, documenting everything, photographing the scene, carefully removing the bodies and specimens for examination. The warehouse had to be kept under guard around the clock. The news of the discovery had spread through Whitechapel, and crowds gathered in the street, drawn by morbid curiosity despite the police cordon. Dr. Phillips supervised the removal of the bodies to the mortuary. It was delicate work. Many of the remains were fragile, partially decomposed, or in advanced stages of dissection that made handling difficult. Each body or collection of body parts was placed in a separate container, labelled and documented, transported under guard to prevent any tampering or theft. The newspapers, of course, seized upon the story with savage enthusiasm. The anatomy murders, new horrors uncovered, warehouse of death discovered in Whitechapel, Baker Street butcher's true lair revealed. The articles competed to provide the most lurid details, the most sensational descriptions, the most horrified commentary. Public outrage reached new heights. How had Blackwood been able to operate a facility like this in the heart of London for years without discovery? How had the police failed so completely to notice what was happening? demands were made for inquiries, for resignations, for wholesale reform of the Metropolitan Police. Superintendent Arnold found himself defending the force before hostile journalists and angry politicians. The truth was uncomfortable. The warehouse district of Whitechapel was a place where police rarely went, where crime was endemic and largely ignored as long as it stayed within its boundaries. The building had been abandoned, its ownership unclear, its interior invisible from the street. Blackwood had chosen his location brilliantly, exploiting the gaps in police coverage and the indifference of a city that preferred not to look too closely at its poorest districts. But the discovery raised new questions about the case against Blackwood. He was already facing trial for multiple murders based on the evidence from Baker Street and his other lodgings. Now, investigators had to incorporate this vast new trove of evidence, had to attempt to identify dozens of additional victims, had to build an even more comprehensive case. Aberlane met with Blackwood again at Newgate Prison, where the doctor was being held awaiting trial. He brought photographs of the Dorset Street warehouse, spread them on the table between them, and watched Blackwood's reaction. The doctor showed no surprise, no concern, only a kind of professional interest. He studied the photographs carefully, nodding occasionally, as if reviewing the work of a colleague. "Ah, yes," he said finally. "My primary research facility. I was wondering when you would find it. I had hoped to clear it out before arrest became inevitable, but time ran short." 43 victims, Aberlane said, his voice hard. 43 women you murdered for your research. How do you justify that? Blackwood looked up from the photographs. Justify? I don't seek to justify, Inspector. I simply state facts. I required specimens for my anatomical studies. I acquired them through the most efficient means available. The number reflects the scope of my research. Nothing more. They were human beings. They had lives, families, futures. They had lives of poverty and hardship, Blackwood corrected. Most were servants or prostitutes, women whose existence served no higher purpose. I gave their deaths meaning, transformed their bodies into objects of scientific value. In a sense, I elevated them. Aberlane felt rage rising but forced himself to remain calm. Losing his temper would accomplish nothing. Instead, he asked the question that had been troubling him since the warehouse discovery. The notebooks mention other researchers. You write about colleagues and fellow students of anatomy. Who are they? Were others involved in your work? For the first time, Blackwood hesitated. His expression became guarded, calculating. That's a metaphorical reference, he said finally. I was speaking of historical figures, Vesalius, Hunter, other great anatomists of the past. I had no accomplices, if that's what you're suggesting. Then why refer to them in the present tense? Why write as if you were part of a community of researchers? Poetic license. I sometimes felt kinship with those historical figures, imagined conversations with them, saw myself as continuing their work. Nothing more than that. Aberlane didn't believe him. There was something in Blackwood's manner, in the way he had hesitated before answering, that suggested he was concealing something. But without additional evidence, there was no way to pursue the question further. The interview concluded with Blackwood being returned to his cell. Aberlane remained in the prison's interview room, thinking about what had been said and what had been left unsaid. Were there others? Had Blackwood been part of some informal network of individuals who shared his obsessions, who perhaps exchanged information or specimens or techniques? The idea was deeply disturbing, suggesting that the horrors they had uncovered might be only one manifestation of a larger phenomenon. Dr. Phillips raised similar concerns when Aberlane discussed the matter with him. The medical profession attracts individuals who are fascinated by the human body, Phillips said. Most channel that fascination into healing and research conducted within ethical boundaries. But there are always outliers, individuals whose fascination becomes obsession, who are willing to transgress moral limits in pursuit of knowledge. Blackwood may be the worst example we've encountered, but I doubt he's unique. So there could be others conducting similar research. Possibly, though probably not on the same scale. Blackwood was extraordinary in his discipline and organisation. Most individuals with similar impulses would be more chaotic, less methodical. They would be caught sooner, or would stop themselves before reaching Blackwood's level of sustained activity. It was cold comfort. The idea that there might be other Blackwoods operating in London or elsewhere, killing and dissecting in secret, was a nightmare that would haunt Aberlane for the rest of his career. The investigation of the warehouse continued through late April and into May. Gradually, through the clothing and personal effects found at the site, investigators were able to identify some of the victims. They were, as expected, mostly young women from the working classes, servants who had disappeared while running errands, prostitutes who had vanished from their usual territories, women newly arrived in London who had never established firm connections. Families were notified where possible. Some had been searching for their missing daughters or sisters for years, had filed missing persons reports that had gone nowhere, had lived with uncertainty and false hope. The confirmation of death brought grief, but also a kind of closure. At least they knew. At least they could mourn properly. Other victims remained unidentified. The bodies were too decomposed, or the personal effects too generic. Or simply no one came forward to claim them. These women would be buried in paupers' graves, with only numbers rather than names to mark their passing. The scale of the tragedy was overwhelming. 43 lives ended for no reason beyond one man's obsessive pursuit of anatomical knowledge. 43 women who should have lived and worked and perhaps married and had children, who should have contributed to the vast tapestry of human life in all its ordinary complexity. Instead, they had become specimens, objects in a collection, their humanity stripped away by someone who saw them as nothing more than raw material for study. As May progressed toward the scheduled June trial, Abilene felt the weight of the case pressing down on him. He had solved it, yes. He had caught the killer, gathered overwhelming evidence, would almost certainly secure a conviction. But he could not escape the feeling that he had failed somehow. Failed the 43 women who had died. Failed the city he had sworn to protect. Failed to recognize the threat until far too late. These thoughts troubled his sleep, invaded his waking hours, colored everything he did. And he knew they would stay with him for the rest of his life. A burden he would carry alongside the knowledge that evil was not always obvious, that monsters could wear respectable faces, and that the darkness at the heart of human nature was deeper and more terrible than most people could imagine. Chapter 8, Theories and Suspicions. The trial of Dr. Henry Blackwood began on June 9, 1873, in the Central Criminal Court at Old Bailey. The courtroom was packed with journalists, medical professionals, members of the public who had queued for hours to secure seats. The case had captured the nation's attention, had become a sensation that transcended London's boundaries, drawing interest from across Britain and beyond. The judge was Sir Alexander Cockburn, Lord Chief Justice of England, a man known for his sharp intellect and intolerance of courtroom theatrics. The prosecution was led by Sir John Holker, the Attorney General himself, reflecting the government's determination to secure a conviction in this most notorious of cases. The defence team, led by a prominent barrister named Montague Williams, faced an almost impossible task. The evidence against Blackwood was overwhelming. His notebooks, the specimens, the photographs, the testimony of landlords and shopkeepers, the warehouse full of bodies. No jury could reasonably doubt his guilt. The only viable defence strategy was to argue insanity, to claim that Blackwood's mind was so disturbed that he could not be held responsible for his actions, that he should be confined to an asylum for the criminally insane rather than executed. The trial began with the prosecution laying out the full scope of Blackwood's crimes. Sir John Holker spoke for more than 3 hours, describing the murders in careful detail, introducing evidence systematically, building a case that was both legally meticulous and emotionally devastating. He called witnesses who testified to Blackwood's movements, his use of false identities, his purchase of surgical equipment and chemicals. He presented the notebooks, reading selected passages that demonstrated Blackwood's cold calculation, his complete lack of remorse, his view of his victims as nothing more than specimens. And he brought forward Mrs. Adelaide Hartley, who described finding the bodies at Baker Street, her voice shaking as she recalled the horror of that morning. Dr. Phillips testified about the autopsies, describing the manner of death, the anatomical skill displayed in the dissections, the evidence that Blackwood had killed repeatedly over a period of years. His testimony was clinical and precise, but its impact was profound. Even the hardened journalists in the gallery looked pale as Phillips described what had been done to the victims. Inspector Abilene took the stand and walked the jury through the investigation, explaining how Blackwood had been identified and captured, describing the warehouse in Whitechapel and what had been found there. He brought with him exhibits, photographs of the crime scenes, samples of Blackwood's handwriting, the preserved specimens that had been central to Blackwood's work. The cumulative effect of the prosecution's case was overwhelming. By the end of the third day of trial, there could be no doubt that Blackwood was guilty of multiple murders, that he had killed systematically and deliberately, that he had shown no remorse and had even taken pride in his work. But the defence was not attempting to argue innocence. Instead, Montague Williams brought forward a series of alienists, Victorian-era psychiatrists, who had examined Blackwood and who testified about his mental state. Dr. Thomas Harrington, a specialist in mental diseases who worked at Bethlehem Royal Hospital, testified that Blackwood displayed what he called moral imbecility, a condition in which the capacity for ethical reasoning was absent or severely impaired, while other intellectual functions remained intact. The defendant is not mad in the conventional sense, Dr. Harrington explained. He shows no signs of delusion, hallucination, or disordered thinking. His reasoning is perfectly logical within its own framework, but he appears to lack the moral sense that guides normal human behaviour. He cannot comprehend why murder is wrong. He views it simply as a means to an end, no different from any other practical action. Another alienist, Dr. James Forbes, testified that Blackwood's obsession with anatomy had become pathological, that it had consumed his personality until nothing else remained. He has become a monomaniac, Forbes said. His entire existence revolves around anatomical study. Everything else, human relationships, social obligations, ethical considerations, has been subordinated to this single obsessive focus. This is not a choice he has made, but a disease that has overtaken him. The prosecution countered with its own expert witnesses. Dr. Henry Maudsley, one of Britain's leading alienists, testified that Blackwood showed no signs of genuine insanity. He is evil, not mad, Maudsley stated bluntly. He has made conscious choices to pursue his goals through murder. He has taken elaborate precautions to avoid detection, demonstrating clear awareness that his actions were criminal. This is not the behaviour of someone who lacks capacity for moral reasoning. This is someone who has reasoned himself into evil, who has constructed an intellectual framework that justifies atrocity. The debate over Blackwood's sanity exposed deep divisions within the emerging field of psychiatry. What constituted insanity? Could someone who reasoned clearly and functioned effectively in society be considered mad simply because they lacked moral sense? Was evil itself a form of insanity, or was it a separate phenomenon that required different understanding and different responses? These questions went to the heart of Victorian anxieties about human nature and moral responsibility. The era's faith in progress and rationality was built on the assumption that human beings were fundamentally reasonable, that education and civilization could improve people, that science could solve the problems that had plagued humanity throughout history. But Blackwood challenged those assumptions. He was educated, rational, civilized in his manner and speech, and yet he'd committed atrocities that seemed to belong to a darker, more savage age. How could such a person exist? What did his existence say about the nature of humanity and the limits of progress? The courtroom became a theatre for these larger debates. Philosophers and theologians weighed in through newspaper articles. Medical journals published analyses of Blackwood's psychology. The case became more than just a criminal trial. It became a referendum on the Victorian understanding of human nature. Throughout the proceedings, Blackwood himself remained eerily calm. He sat in the dock, dressed neatly, listening attentively to the testimony, occasionally taking notes as if he were attending an academic lecture rather than his own murder trial. When called to testify in his own defence, he spoke clearly and without apparent emotion. "I do not deny my actions," he told the court. "I killed those women and used their bodies for anatomical research. This is factually accurate and I see no purpose in denying it. What I contest is the characterisation of these actions as crimes. I was conducting legitimate scientific research using methods that were unconventional, but not fundamentally different from practices accepted in medical schools and teaching hospitals." The prosecutor, Sir John Holker, cross-examined him vigorously. "You claim your research was legitimate, but legitimate research does not involve murder." "Legitimate research requires specimens," Blackwood replied. "Medical schools obtain cadavers through legal channels, yes, but those channels provide insufficient material of inadequate quality. I required better specimens, and I acquired them through the most efficient means available, by murdering innocent women, by utilising individuals whose lives contributed little to society and transforming them into objects of scientific value. The net benefit to human knowledge exceeds the cost of their individual existences. A murmur of horror ran through the courtroom. Even Blackwood's own defence counsel looked dismayed at this response. The judge had to call for order. Sir John pressed further. "Do you feel any remorse for what you've done?" Blackwood considered the question thoughtfully. "Remorse implies I believe my actions were wrong. I do not hold that belief. Therefore, remorse would be illogical. I regret that society has chosen to criminalise my research, as this prevents me from continuing it. But I do not regret the research itself. You took 43 lives. I utilised 43 specimens. The distinction is semantics, merely a matter of framing. This testimony damaged the defence's insanity argument significantly. Blackwood's responses demonstrated clear understanding of the nature of his actions and society's view of them. He was not delusional. He was not unable to distinguish right from wrong. He simply disagreed with society's moral framework and had chosen to act according to his own. The trial continued for 2 weeks. Witnesses came and went. Evidence was presented and debated. Legal arguments were refined and countered, but the outcome was never seriously in doubt. On June 23rd, the jury retired to consider their verdict. They returned in less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts, guilty of multiple murders, no recommendation for mercy. The judge, Lord Chief Justice Cockburn, delivered the sentence in a grave voice that carried through the silent courtroom. "Henry Blackwood, you have been found guilty of the most heinous crimes it has been my misfortune to encounter in more than 40 years on the bench. You have murdered dozens of innocent women in pursuit of what you claim was scientific knowledge. You have shown no remorse, no understanding of the magnitude of your crimes, no recognition of the humanity of your victims. The law provides only one penalty for such actions. You will be taken from this place to a place of execution, and there you will be hanged by the neck until you are dead. May God have mercy on your soul." Blackwood received the sentence without visible reaction. As he was led from the dock, he looked toward the public gallery where Abilene sat, and for a moment their eyes met. Blackwood smiled slightly, that same clinical expression Abilene had seen before, and then he was gone, disappearing down the stairs to the cells below. The execution was scheduled for July 15th, 1873, to be carried out at Newgate Prison. Unlike the public executions of earlier decades, this would be conducted privately, behind prison walls, witnessed only by officials and select representatives of the press. In the weeks between sentence and execution, Blackwood received numerous visitors, journalists seeking final interviews, alienists hoping to conduct one last examination, clergymen attempting to elicit confession and repentance. His family, a brother and elderly mother who had not known of his crimes, came to say farewell, leaving in tears while Blackwood remained dry-eyed and unmoved. Abilene visited him one final time 3 days before the execution. He wanted to ask one last question, the question that had haunted him since the trial's conclusion. "The notebooks mention colleagues," Abilene said, "sitting across from Blackwood in the prison interview room. You wrote as if you were part of a community of researchers. I need to know. Are there others? Are there other men conducting similar work?" Blackwood studied him for a long moment. "What would you do with such information, Inspector? Hunt them down? Prevent them from pursuing knowledge as you've prevented me? I would stop them from murdering innocent people. You assume they would be murdering. Perhaps they found other methods, more subtle approaches. Perhaps they work within the system, using their positions in hospitals or medical schools to pursue research that appears legitimate while serving deeper purposes. That's not an answer, because there is no simple answer. Yes, Inspector, there are others who share my fascination with anatomical perfection, who recognise that conventional ethics constrain the pursuit of knowledge. But they are careful. They are cautious. They will not be caught as I was caught, and you will never know who they are because they wear their masks well, and you lack the vision to see beyond them. Give me names, Blackwood smiled. Even if I possess such information, which I neither confirm nor deny, what makes you think I would share it? You're going to hang me in 3 days. What possible incentive do I have to assist your investigation? Abilene left the prison frustrated and deeply uneasy. Blackwood's words suggested there might indeed be others, a network of individuals pursuing similar research through more careful means. But without names or evidence, there was nothing he could do except remain vigilant, watch for patterns, hope that if others existed they would eventually make mistakes that would reveal them. On July 15th, at 8 o'clock in the morning, Dr. Henry Blackwood was hanged at Newgate Prison. The execution was carried out by William Marwood, Britain's official executioner, who calculated the drop precisely to ensure instant death. Blackwood walked to the gallows calmly, refused the hood that was offered, and stood composed as the noose was placed around his neck. His last words were brief and characteristic. "The work continues, gentlemen. Whether you acknowledge it or not, the work continues." Then the trapdoor opened, and Henry Blackwood fell to his death. The body was left hanging for the requisite hour, then cut down and buried within the prison grounds, as was standard practice for executed criminals. No marker would identify the grave. Blackwood would be forgotten, his name struck from medical registers, his existence erased as much as law and custom allowed. But Abberlin, standing among the official witnesses to the execution, could not escape the chill that ran through him at those final words. The work continues. It was the same message carved into the mantelpiece at Baker Street, the same phrase that had appeared throughout Blackwood's notebooks, and now it was his final statement to the world. What work? What had Blackwood believed he was contributing to? And were there truly others who would carry on after him, conducting their own terrible research in secret, learning from his mistakes, becoming even more careful and difficult to catch? These questions would haunt Abberlin for the rest of his career. He would spend years watching for similar cases, alert for patterns that might indicate another killer with Blackwood's profile. He would correspond with police forces across Britain and Europe, sharing information, looking for connections, and occasionally he would hear rumours. A physician dismissed from a hospital under mysterious circumstances, a medical student expelled for conducting unauthorised dissections, bodies found in isolated locations bearing signs of anatomical examination. Nothing conclusive, nothing that could be proven, but enough to keep the unease alive. The Victorian era's faith in progress and rationality had been shaken by the Baker Street butcher. The idea that education and civilization could eliminate evil from human nature seemed less certain. The darkness at the heart of some individuals appeared to be beyond the reach of reason or reform, and somewhere in the vast machinery of London, in the hospitals and medical schools, in the laboratories and dissection theatres, in the minds of men who studied the human body with obsessive intensity, that darkness might still be stirring, waiting for its next opportunity to emerge. Now, Chapter 9, the final confrontation. The execution of Dr. Henry Blackwood should have brought closure to the case. The killer had been caught, tried, convicted, and punished. Justice, such as it was, had been served. The 43 known victims could be properly mourned, their families could attempt to move forward, and London could try to forget the horror that had stalked its streets. But Inspector William Abberlin found he could not let the matter rest. Blackwood's final words haunted him. The work continues. The phrase suggested purpose and continuation, hinted at a larger framework that extended beyond one man's obsession. And there were troubling loose ends in the case that had never been satisfactorily resolved. The notebooks found in Blackwood's possession contained references to correspondence with other researchers, to shared observations, to what appeared to be an exchange of information and techniques. Yet no letters had been found, no addresses of correspondence, no physical evidence of this network Blackwood claimed existed. The warehouse in Whitechapel had been equipped with materials and apparatus beyond what Blackwood could have afforded on his own. Medical equipment was expensive, particularly the specialised instruments found at the site. The preserved specimens required substantial quantities of chemicals. The rent on the warehouse itself, while modest, still represented a significant expense when combined with the costs of Blackwood's various lodgings. Where had the money come from? Blackwood had not been wealthy. His medical practice, before he abandoned it to pursue his obsessive research, had been modest and never particularly successful. Yet he had financed years of killing and research, had maintained multiple locations, had purchased equipment and supplies regularly. These financial questions had been raised during the trial but never fully answered. Blackwood had claimed to have savings from his years of practice, but the amounts didn't match the level of expenditure the investigation had documented. Abberlin spent the weeks following the execution reviewing every aspect of the case, looking for connections and patterns that might have been missed during the intense pressure of the initial investigation. He requested access to Blackwood's bank records, such as they were, and discovered that the doctor had received periodic deposits from a source identified only as research funding in the ledgers. The bank manager, when questioned, remembered that the deposits had come in the form of bank drafts drawn on various London financial institutions. They were never large enough to attract particular attention, £50 to £100 at irregular intervals, but over time they accumulated to substantial sums. "Can you trace the drafts back to their origin?" Abeline asked. The manager shook his head regretfully. They were drawn on different banks, always made payable to bearer rather than to a specific name. Whoever issued them took care to ensure they couldn't be easily traced. It was the kind of financial arrangement someone would use if they wanted to support Blackwood's work while maintaining complete anonymity. Someone with resources and sophisticated knowledge of banking practices. Someone who perhaps shared Blackwood's interests but was far too careful to be directly associated with his crimes. Abeline began to investigate the medical establishments where Blackwood had trained and worked. Guy's Hospital, where Blackwood had received his medical education in the 1840s, maintained records of all its students. A visit to the hospital's archives revealed that Blackwood had been an exceptional student, particularly gifted in anatomy and surgical technique. He was obsessed even then, the hospital archivist. An elderly physician named Dr. William Withers told Abeline. "I was a junior instructor when Blackwood was a student. I remember him spending hours in the dissection laboratory, working long after other students had left. He would dissect the same cadaver multiple times, examining every structure with extraordinary thoroughness. We thought it was dedication to his studies. Now, of course, we understand it was something darker." Did he have close associates during his student years, friends who shared his interests? Dr. Withers consulted the old records. There was a small group of students who spent considerable time together. Blackwood was part of it. They called themselves the Anatomical Society, an informal study group that met regularly to discuss their work. "Let me see if I can find the names." He produced a faded register from 1847, showing the membership of various student organisations. The Anatomical Society had consisted of 6 members: Henry Blackwood, James Pemberton, Charles Ashford, Thomas Whitmore, Edward Sterling and Robert Hammond. Abeline copied the names carefully. What happened to these other men? Did they complete their medical training? Most of them went on to successful careers. Let me recall. Pemberton became a surgeon at St Bartholomew's Hospital, I believe. Ashford established a private practice in Harley Street. Whitmore emigrated to India with the Colonial Medical Service. Sterling died in the cholera epidemic of 1854. And Hammond, I'm not certain what became of Hammond. He left Guy's before completing his studies, if I remember correctly. 6 names. 5 of them, aside from Blackwood, had gone on to apparently legitimate medical careers, but the 6th, Robert Hammond, had disappeared from the records. Abeline began investigating each name systematically. Dr. James Pemberton was indeed a respected surgeon at St Bartholomew's, now in his 50s, with an impeccable reputation. Dr. Charles Ashford practiced on Harley Street, treating wealthy patients, living in a fine house in Belgravia. Dr. Thomas Whitmore had served 20 years in India and was now retired, living in Bath. All of them appeared to be exactly what they claimed to be: successful physicians with no obvious connection to Blackwood's crimes. But Robert Hammond was more difficult to trace. He had left Guy's Hospital in 1849, 2 years into his medical studies, for reasons that were not clear from the records. After that, he seemed to vanish from London's medical community. No record of him qualifying as a physician, no registration with the medical societies, no listed address or practice. It was as if he had simply disappeared. Abeline expanded his search, checking passenger lists for anyone named Robert Hammond who might have emigrated. He found several men with that name who had left Britain during the 1850s, bound for America, Australia, South Africa. But none matched the approximate age and background of Blackwood's fellow student. Then, almost by accident, he found a different kind of record. A small notice in a medical journal from 1852 mentioned that a Mr. Robert Hammond had been appointed as an anatomical assistant at a private medical school in Bloomsbury. Not a qualified physician, but someone who prepared cadavers for dissection, maintained anatomical specimens, assisted with teaching. Abeline felt a sudden chill. An anatomical assistant would have precisely the skills and knowledge that Blackwood had displayed: access to bodies, familiarity with dissection techniques, understanding of preservation methods. and the position would be obscure enough that someone could work in it for years without attracting particular attention. He traced the medical school mentioned in the notice, the Bloomsbury Academy of Medicine, a private institution that had operated during the 1850s and 1860s, catering to students who couldn't afford or couldn't gain admission to the larger teaching hospitals. The academy had closed in 1869, its building sold and converted to other purposes. But records of the academy's staff were preserved in the archives of the Royal College of Physicians. Abberlin obtained permission to examine them and found what he was looking for. Robert Hammond had indeed worked at the Bloomsbury Academy from 1852 until its closure in 1869, serving as chief anatomical assistant for the final decade of that period, and his address, as of 1869, was listed as number 14 Gower Street, Bloomsbury. Abberlin felt his pulse quicken. Gower Street was less than half a mile from where Blackwood had been arrested in April. If Hammond was still living there, he might represent the connection Abberlin had been seeking, the colleague who had funded and perhaps encouraged Blackwood's research. He took Sergeant Godley and 2 constables to Gower Street on a grey morning in early August. Number 14 was a narrow townhouse, 3 stories tall, wedged between similar buildings in a respectable but unfashionable street. The ground floor was occupied by a small publisher's office. The upper floors were divided into lodgings. The landlord, when questioned, confirmed that a Mr. Robert Hammond had lodged on the top floor for many years, perhaps since the early 1870s. He was a quiet tenant, kept irregular hours, paid his rent on time, described as a man in his 50s, lean and tall with grey hair and a reserved manner. "Is he at home now?" Abberlin asked. The landlord thought for a moment. "I haven't seen him in several days. But that's not unusual. He sometimes goes away for periods without notice. We need to see his rooms." The landlord hesitated. "Do you have a warrant?" Abberlin didn't, but he had learned that a confident manner and official bearing could sometimes substitute for legal authorization. "This is a murder investigation. If you obstruct us, you may find yourself charged as an accessory. Now the key, please." The landlord capitulated and produced a key. The 4 men climbed the narrow stairs to the top floor, where a single door opened onto Hammond's lodgings. The rooms were neat and sparsely furnished. A bed, a desk, a bookshelf, a small fireplace. But what immediately caught Abberlin's attention were the books, hundreds of them, filling the shelves and stacked on every available surface. Medical texts, anatomical atlases, works on surgery and pathology, and among them, Abberlin recognised several volumes that were far from mainstream: medieval manuscripts on dissection, Renaissance works on anatomy that had been considered heretical in their time, modern treatises on preservation and mummification. The desk was clear except for a single leather-bound journal. Abberlin opened it carefully and found page after page of handwriting that looked disturbingly familiar. Not Blackwood's hand, but similar in its precision and medical terminology. The journal appeared to be a record of correspondence, letters sent and received, though no actual letters were present, references to our work and the research, and the advancement of anatomical knowledge beyond conventional constraints. And then, 2/3 through the journal, he found it. Received communication from H.B. regarding new specimens acquired, quality exceptional, preservation methods improving. Suggest increased support to allow expansion of research facilities. H.B. Henry Blackwood. The entry was dated February 1873, just weeks before Blackwood's arrest. Abberlin looked up at Godley. "Hammond is Blackwood's patron, the one who funded his research. We need to find him immediately." They searched the rooms thoroughly, but found no indication of where Hammond might have gone. His clothes were still in the wardrobe. His personal effects remained in place. It appeared he had left suddenly, perhaps as soon as news of Blackwood's arrest reached him, taking with him only what he could carry. "Check with the landlord," Abberlin instructed one of the constables. "Find out exactly when Hammond was last seen, whether he took luggage, anything that might indicate where he was going." The constable returned with troubling news. Hammond had been seen on the morning of April 11th. The day after Blackwood's arrest was reported in the newspapers. He had come down the stairs carrying a single leather valise, had told the landlord he was going away for a few days, and had departed. He had not been seen since. Nearly 4 months. Hammond had had 4 months to flee London, to travel to another part of Britain, or to leave the country entirely. The trail would be impossibly cold. But Abberlin was not ready to give up. He had the journal, which contained valuable information even if it didn't immediately lead to Hammond's location. He had the list of medical texts and specialised volumes, which might indicate Hammond's particular interests and areas of expertise, and he had the names of the other members of that long-ago student society at Guy's Hospital. If Hammond was fleeing, he might seek refuge with someone he trusted, someone from his past. The investigation needed to trace all possible connections, interview everyone who had known Hammond, reconstruct his movements and associations over the past decades. It would take time, it would require resources, and it might ultimately prove futile. Hammond could be on the other side of the world by now, living under a false name, beyond the reach of British law. But Abberlin was determined to try. The case had consumed him, had become more than just another investigation. It represented something larger, a battle against a kind of evil that hid behind respectability and intellectual pretension, that justified atrocity through appeals to knowledge and progress. Blackwood had been caught and punished, but if Hammond remained free, if he continued to support others who shared his and Blackwood's obsessions, then the horror might continue in different forms, might spread beyond London to other cities and countries. The investigation continued through August and into September. Detectives interviewed the other members of the Anatomical Society, looking for any indication they might be harbouring Hammond or corresponding with him. All claimed to have had no contact with him in years, and their shock at learning of his apparent connection to Blackwood seemed genuine. Shipping records were checked for any Robert Hammond who might have left Britain in the months since April. Police forces across Europe were contacted and provided with Hammond's description. Watch lists were established at ports and railway stations. But as weeks turned into months, hope of finding Hammond faded. He had vanished as completely as his former colleague had once moved through London, invisible, careful, always one step ahead of pursuit. The investigation was finally suspended in November 1873, 7 months after it had begun, declared inactive but never officially closed. Hammond's name remained on wanted lists. His descriptions circulated periodically to police forces and border controls. But practically speaking, the search was over. Abberlin wrote a final report documenting everything that had been discovered about Hammond and the possible network of individuals who shared Blackwood's interests. The report was filed in Scotland Yard's archives, marked confidential, available only to senior investigators, and there it would remain for decades, a testament to a case that was solved but never fully resolved, to a killer caught but whose work, as he had promised, continued in ways that law enforcement could not prevent or even detect. Chapter 10. The Silence of History. The years passed, and London moved on. The Baker Street butcher case faded from the front pages of newspapers, replaced by new scandals, new crimes, new sensations that captured the public imagination, briefly before they too were forgotten. The warehouse in Whitechapel was demolished in 1875, the site cleared and eventually built over with tenement housing. The lodging house at number 47 Baker Street continued operating under new ownership, though it never entirely escaped the shadow of what had happened in Room 7. Detective Inspector William Abberline continued his career with the Metropolitan Police, rising eventually to the rank of Chief Inspector. He investigated hundreds of cases over the following decades, solved most of them, earned a reputation as one of Scotland Yard's most capable detectives. But he never forgot the Baker Street case, never stopped looking for patterns that might indicate similar crimes, never stopped wondering about Robert Hammond and whether others like him operated in London's shadows. In 1888, 15 years after Blackwood's execution, Abberline was assigned to investigate a series of murders in Whitechapel that would become known as the Jack the Ripper killings. The brutal slaying and mutilation of prostitutes, the surgical precision of some of the cuts, the taunting messages left for police, all of it brought back memories of the Blackwood case. Abberline wondered, as he walked the streets where the Ripper's victims were found, whether there might be a connection. The Ripper's crimes were different in many ways, more public, more theatrical, less methodical than Blackwood's carefully concealed research. But the anatomical knowledge displayed in some of the murders suggested medical training, and the pattern of killing vulnerable women was eerily familiar. He pulled the old files on the Baker Street case, reviewed the information about Robert Hammond, looked again at the list of medical professionals who had been connected, however tenuously, to Blackwood's circle. But none of them could be definitively linked to the Ripper crimes. The investigation ended, as the Ripper investigation would end, without resolution. The killer was never identified, never caught, never punished. Aberlin retired from the Metropolitan Police in 1892 after 30 years of service. He moved with his wife to Bournemouth, a seaside town on the south coast, hoping for peace and distance from the memories that haunted him. But retirement brought not peace, but too much time to think, too many hours to dwell on the cases that had never been properly solved, the questions that had never been satisfactorily answered. He spent his retirement years writing memoirs, though he never published them. The manuscript, running to hundreds of pages, documented his career, his cases, his observations on the changing nature of crime and law enforcement. Large sections dealt with the Baker Street butcher case, with Blackwood's psychology, with the search for Hammond that had consumed so much effort and produced so little result. "The case troubles me still," he wrote in 1895, more than 20 years after the events. Not because Blackwood escaped justice, he was caught and punished as the law required, but because I cannot shake the conviction that the horror did not end with his execution. Somewhere, in ways I cannot trace or prove, his work did continue, as he promised it would. Hammond vanished, yes, but did he stop? Or did he simply become more careful, more hidden, continuing his support of research that law and ethics condemn? And were there others? The medical profession is vast, encompassing thousands of practitioners, most are decent men devoted to healing. But among them, surely, must be some whose fascination with the human body has become obsession, whose pursuit of knowledge has led them beyond moral boundaries. Blackwood was extraordinary in his methodical dedication to his research, but I doubt he was unique in his fundamental nature. What haunts me most is the possibility that some future generation might discover Blackwood's notebooks, might read his careful documentation of anatomical findings, might see not a record of murder, but a contribution to medical knowledge. Will they view him as a monster or as a misunderstood pioneer? Will the horror of his methods be forgiven in light of whatever scientific value his observations might hold? I hope not. I hope that future generations will be wise enough to recognize that knowledge gained through evil means is contaminated, that no scientific benefit can justify such crimes. But I am not certain. The march of progress often leaves ethics behind. What is condemned today may be rationalized tomorrow. These were the thoughts of an old man looking back on a career defined by the fight against darkness, wondering whether that fight had been worth the cost, whether any real progress had been made, or whether evil simply adapted and continued under new guises. Aberlin died in 1929 at the age of 86, having outlived most of his contemporaries from the Metropolitan Police. His memoirs were found among his effects and were quietly archived, deemed too sensitive for publication. They would remain sealed in the archives of New Scotland Yard for decades, accessible only to senior officials and selected researchers. The fate of Robert Hammond remained unknown. No trace of him was ever found after his disappearance in April 1873. He became one of the great unsolved mysteries of Victorian crime, a man who vanished completely, leaving behind only questions and uncomfortable suspicions. But occasionally, over the years that followed, there were whispers, reports that reached Scotland Yard or were published in obscure medical journals, stories that suggested Blackwood's work might indeed have continued in some form. In 1879, a physician in Manchester was dismissed from his hospital position under mysterious circumstances. Rumours circulated about unauthorised experiments, about the suspicious disappearance of bodies from the hospital mortuary. The physician vanished before any formal investigation could be conducted, and the hospital administration declined to pursue the matter, preferring to bury the scandal quietly. In 1884, a private medical school in Edinburgh was discovered to have a collection of preserved anatomical specimens of questionable provenance. The specimens showed signs of professional preparation and included organs from individuals who appeared to have been young and healthy, not the typical sources for medical specimens. An investigation was launched but quickly suppressed when it became clear that several prominent physicians had connections to the school and to the specimen collection. In 1891, police in Paris investigated the disappearance of several young women from the city's working-class districts. The investigation uncovered evidence that at least some of the women had been seen with a middle-aged man who identified himself as a medical researcher from England, but the trail went cold before the man could be identified or located. Were these incidents connected to Hammond or to others who shared Blackwood's obsessions? Or were they simply coincidental crimes, unrelated except in the minds of investigators who saw patterns where none existed? The truth was impossible to determine. The evidence was always fragmentary, the investigations always incomplete, hampered by institutional resistance to scandal and by the difficulty of pursuing cases across jurisdictional boundaries. What was certain was that the questions Blackwood had raised about the relationship between medical knowledge and ethical constraints did not die with him. The debate about how far science should go in pursuit of understanding, about what methods were acceptable in the acquisition of knowledge, would continue through the 20th century and beyond. The Nazi medical experiments of World War II would demonstrate that Blackwood's willingness to sacrifice individuals for research was not unique, that entire state apparatuses could be mobilized in support of anatomical and medical research that disregarded human dignity and rights. The revelation of those atrocities would shock the world and lead to new international laws and ethical frameworks designed to prevent such horrors from recurring. But even in the post-war period, cases would emerge of researchers who crossed ethical boundaries. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment, the radiation exposure studies, the various instances of experimentation on prisoners, patients, and vulnerable populations. Each time society would express horror, would promise that such things would never happen again, would establish new regulations and oversight mechanisms, and each time, years or decades later, new cases would emerge, proving that the temptation to pursue knowledge without ethical constraint remained, that some individuals would always be willing to sacrifice others in service of what they perceived as greater goods. The notebooks of Dr. Henry Blackwood were preserved in Scotland Yard's archives, along with the other evidence from the case. They were occasionally requested by medical historians or criminologists studying the history of serial murder, but access was tightly controlled. The fear remained that publication or wide distribution might somehow validate Blackwood's work, might provide a template for future killers, or might contain genuinely useful anatomical information that would create uncomfortable moral dilemmas about how to treat knowledge gained through murder. In 1973, on the 100th anniversary of Blackwood's execution, a medical historian named Dr. Margaret Thornton was granted access to the notebooks for research on a book about Victorian medical ethics. She spent months studying Blackwood's writings, analysing his anatomical observations, trying to understand both the man and his era. Her conclusions, published in a limited academic edition, were troubling. Blackwood's anatomical observations, she found, were indeed accurate and detailed. His preservation techniques were sophisticated. His documentation was thorough. If one could separate the observations from the methods by which they were obtained, his work did contain information of potential medical value. This creates an impossible ethical dilemma, Dr. Thornton wrote. We cannot use this knowledge without in some sense validating the murders through which it was obtained. Yet if the knowledge is accurate and potentially beneficial, does suppressing it serve any purpose beyond making us feel morally comfortable? Are we punishing the victims a second time by ensuring their deaths contributed nothing to human understanding? I have no resolution to offer. I only observe that the questions Blackwood raised about the relationship between knowledge and ethics, about what sacrifices are acceptable in pursuit of understanding, remain as troubling today as they were a century ago. We have not answered them. We have only become better at avoiding them. The book generated controversy within medical and academic circles. Some argued that Blackwood's work should be destroyed, that no knowledge gained through such evil should be preserved or studied. Others maintained that suppressing information, however it was obtained, was itself unethical, that understanding the past required confronting even its most uncomfortable aspects. The debate was never fully resolved. Blackwood's notebooks remain in the archives, classified and restricted, accessible only through special permission, a repository of horror and knowledge inextricably mixed, a testament to humanity's capacity for both extraordinary achievement and extraordinary evil. The victims of the Baker Street butcher are remembered, though most only as numbers and brief descriptions in police files. A few were identified through the efforts of investigators and received proper burials with their names on the stones. Most remained anonymous, buried in unmarked graves, forgotten by history except as entries in the case records. In 2023, 150 years after the discovery at Baker Street, a small memorial was placed near the site of the demolished warehouse in Whitechapel. It bore a simple inscription: in memory of the victims of the Baker Street murders, 1871-1873, women whose names are mostly forgotten but whose lives mattered. May they rest in peace. The memorial attracted little attention. Few passers-by understood its significance. The case had faded from public memory, surviving only in historical records and occasional academic studies. One more dark chapter in London's long and often violent history. But for those who knew the story, who had read the case files or studied the evidence, the memorial served as a reminder of what had happened in those years, of how easily evil could hide behind respectability, of how the pursuit of knowledge without ethical constraint could lead to monstrous acts. And it served as a warning, though whether anyone heeded that warning was uncertain. The temptations that had driven Blackwood, the desire for perfect understanding, the willingness to sacrifice others in pursuit of that understanding, the conviction that knowledge justified any method, those temptations remained. They would always remain, as long as human beings sought to understand the mysteries of life and death, as long as some individuals placed their own goals above the rights and dignity of others. The work continues, Blackwood had said, and in a sense, he was right. Not his specific research, perhaps, but the eternal struggle between the pursuit of knowledge and respect for human life, between scientific progress and ethical constraint, between understanding and compassion. That struggle would continue long after Blackwood's name was forgotten, long after the physical evidence of his crimes had crumbled to dust. It was a struggle at the heart of human nature, between our drive to know and our obligation to care for one another, between the cold fascination with how things work and the warm recognition that some things should remain sacred beyond the reach of purely intellectual inquiry. The sun set over London on that spring evening in 2023, much as it had set on countless evenings before. The city had changed almost beyond recognition since 1873. The horse-drawn carriages replaced by automobiles, the gas lamps by electric lights, the Victorian tenements by modern buildings of glass and steel. But beneath the surface changes, beneath the technological progress and social evolution, the fundamental questions remain the same. What are the limits of knowledge? What sacrifices are acceptable in its pursuit? How do we balance progress with protection of human dignity? How do we ensure that those who possess specialized knowledge use it wisely and ethically? These questions had no easy answers in Blackwood's time. They have no easy answers today. They will likely have no easy answers a century from now. But perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the struggle itself is important, the eternal vigilance required to prevent knowledge from becoming an excuse for cruelty, science from becoming a justification for inhumanity. Perhaps the real lesson of the Baker Street butcher is not that such monsters exist, that has always been true, but that they must be recognized and stopped, that society must remain alert to the dangers of obsession masquerading as research, of evil dressed in the respectable clothing of intellectual pursuit. The darkness at the heart of human nature does not disappear. It merely waits, patient and persistent, for opportunities to emerge. And it is the responsibility of each generation to recognize it, to name it, to resist it, however it manifests in their particular time and place. The candles have burned low, the night has grown deep, and history, having whispered its dark truths, prepares to turn the page and rest, until the next story, until the next shadow, until the next time when humanity must confront the monsters it creates and decide whether to look away or stand and fight. For now, there is only silence, the silence of archives and old records, the silence of graves unmarked and stories untold, the silence that falls when horror has been acknowledged and the living return to their lives, carrying with them the knowledge of what happened and the hope that it will not happen again. Though hope, as history teaches, is a fragile thing, and the work, in its various forms, always continues. The end.